Our first guest is Louise Sheiner. She is a Robert S. Kerr Senior Fellow in Economic Studies and Policy Director for the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at the Brookings Institution. She served as an economist with the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and as a senior economist in the fiscal analysis section for the Research and Statistics Division there. I've asked her to come talk about some new research that she and her colleagues did about the status and the current status and the status going forward of state pensions. This is really innovative, in-depth, unique research that Brookings did, and so she's going to talk about that, and then she'll have time for questions. It's 11:10 right now. We have her until 11:50, or since I've been jabbering here for a few extra minutes, we'll go to 11:55 to get enough questions in. But with that, I will turn it over to Louise.
So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to share my screen in a second. I want this to be a casual conversation to the extent possible. If you have questions or experiences from your state that you want to share, that would be great. So I'm going to talk about the sustainability of state and local government pensions. We call it a public finance approach. I'll tell you why as I go through the slides. This is based on work by colleagues Jamie Lenny, Byron Lutz, Finn Shula. I'm going to give you the disclaimers even though they're not here. So Jamie works at the Bank of England and Byron works at the Fed. And for both of them, this is our opinion and not representing those of the Bank of England or the Board of Governors. Okay, so what our paper did was ask the following pretty basic questions. Are state and local pension plans fiscally sustainable, meaning that they are likely to be able to pay their benefits without changes to employer contributions or cuts to benefits, right? So if nothing changes, will they be able to keep on paying benefits? If not, what do they need to do to be sustainable and how quickly do they need to act? Okay, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of background slides. So as you probably know, most state and local employees do have defined benefit pension plans. Most private sector workers do not. What's a defined benefit pension plan? It's kind of like Social Security. You work a certain number of years. When you retire, you get a pension benefit until you die. That's going to be based on how many years you worked and what your wages were, right? Most private sector workers now have defined contribution plans, which is like the employer puts money in at the front, and then whatever it grows to over time is what you've got. Defined benefit guarantees a certain benefit in the future, which is why you worry about whether or not the plans are going to actually be able to make that payment, right? State and local government pensions are really important economic institutions. They have almost $5 trillion in assets, and they cover about 10 million retirees. And about a quarter of those retirees don't have Social Security. They only have their pension from their state. So it's an alternative for about a quarter of plans. So that's particularly important economic institution for them. There has been a ton of discussion of the fact that the plans are unfunded or underfunded, right? What does that even mean? How do you know how funded a plan is? So what is fundedness? It's the ratio of the assets to the liabilities, right? So how much do they have to pay out in the future and how much will they have? So that you know what the value of the assets is. It's like, what do I have in the bank? It's the stocks, the bonds, everything. You can just, you know what it is. It's the market value of their holdings. You don't know liabilities. Liabilities is based on some estimate of what the wage growth is going to be and when people will retire and how long they will live. And so to calculate fundedness, actuaries project these benefits based on the pension rules and assumptions about productivity growth and demographics and wage growth and retirement probabilities, all those things that go into it. And then they calculate what economists call a present value by discounting the stream of benefits to today, right? And the question, basically you're saying, if I have to pay out all this much money, what is the value of that in today's dollars, right? So one of the big controversies is what rate of return to use to discount those assets, to discount the liabilities, right? So I'm going to say, if I owe you $100 next year, what's it in present value today? It's going to be 100 divided by 1 plus the interest rate. And then the question is, what interest rate? The actuaries say, well, I'm going to use what I think I'm going to make on my stocks and bonds to discount the liabilities. The big argument in academia about these plans have been about that rate. The finance economists say that's the wrong rate. these plans are basically guaranteed. We'll talk a little bit about that, but basically they're guaranteed. And in certain states, they are completely guaranteed. You cannot change them. So if someone's worked and is owed some benefit based on what they've worked, it is a promise to that person to pay that the state can't get out of, or the plan can't get out of. And so because governments have to pay these benefits, they say that's a riskless that's a riskless benefit. It can't change. And so you should discount at the risk-free rate. The risk-free rate is much, much lower. So using risk-free rates, Josh Rao, who's really been kind of on the forefront of this, has said the unfunded liabilities were like 4 trillion and plans were only funded. That was in 2017. When we use today's much lower interest rates, much lower treasury rates, which is what people think of as the risk-free rate, plans are even less funded, just 35% funded, meaning if you look at what they owe versus what they have, they only have about a third of it, all right? And this fact that these plans are really underfunded, especially when you discount at these appropriate rates, has led to just totally widespread concern about this is a crisis, the plans can't pay their benefits. That's come from academics, the press, rating agencies, policymakers are always talking about the crisis in pension plans. Josh Rao and Novi Mark said, because they're unfunded, they have failed to provide economic security in old age in a financially stable way. So they've made these promises to the retirees and they cannot fund it, so they're not gonna be able to keep them. That's how the press has reported it. We just had like a Google search or Factiva search about the word state and local pension and crisis, and you can see it went up a lot. It's come down. This ended in 2018. We haven't updated it, but clearly it was very much in the news. And then of course, COVID came around, but that's how it's been perceived and still is, I think. So, and one of the consequences of it is pension plans have actually been sharply increasing funding over time. So if you look at this is relative to 1998, we're comparing the red dotted line is spending on structures, because we have data on that sort of construction spending, road spending, buildings. The dotted blue line is spending on wages and salaries. And the black line is spending on pensions. So if you look at it relative to 1998 as a share of tax receipts, the only thing that's gone up is pensions. So you get the sense that maybe pension funds are crowding out every other priority, right? So they can't spend money on roads and they can't spend money on maybe getting the lead out of water or on hiring more teachers because they feel this need to just keep putting more money in their pensions. So the real sort of point of our paper is that this discussion kind of leaps from the fact that plans are unfunded to that plans can't pay their benefits. They sort of assume that plans must be fully funded in order to pay benefits, and that is actually not true, right? Plans can be sustainable in the sense that benefits are payable for the foreseeable future without changing contributions, while pension contributions are stable without being fully funded. And one example to think about is Social Security. Social Security has basically always been an unfunded program. They have some assets, but they're very small. And it's a pay-as-you-go program. The money coming in is used to pay the money going out. They don't have any stocks and bonds, or not very many, but they have money coming in every year and they just pay it out. Now, some people say, well, that's a Ponzi scheme, but a government can do that. As long as the money coming in is good enough to pay the benefit, it's fine. So as long as the taxes are at least as large as the benefits, you're fine. Now we do have an issue with Social Security. The benefits are rising faster than the taxes because of population aging. So the growth rate of the workforce isn't as big as the growth rate of the elderly population. And so there's going to have to be made some adjustments. But nobody's talking about making the kind of adjustments that would be necessary in order for Social Security to be fully funded. Those would be massive. They're just talking about small changes in payroll taxes or cuts in benefits to equilibrate, again, those taxes and benefits, and not starting to be funded. It would still just be a pay-go system. You just have to adjust. And that's kind of what we're all talking about. Imagine you just thought about making those kinds of adjustments, right?
Louise, I have one question. Question in chat here from Stephen Caruso. Who are the kinds of people who don't have Social Security but have a state or local pension?
So I think it's mostly older state and local workers. I think for new hires, they're mostly in Social Security, but I'm not 100% sure of that. I think it's just some plans. In fact, actually, I know that's not true. My daughter's about to be a resident in Ohio, and she will not be, the contributions will just be into her plan. So it's some states, and I don't actually know a lot about which states have decided and when. when Social Security first started, there were these state plans, and so they were just parallel. There's a lot of talk actually about making states part of the Social Security system, because I think one of the things that happens is people work for a while for the state, and then they work for Social Security, and in some sense, people think that there may be double dipping. But I don't know a ton about that. You can look it up. At the last slide, I give you some resources to look up some of these things. And there's a place called the Boston Center for Retirement Research that has like lots of little 2-3 pages on all these kinds of issues. They're all about state and local pensions. So it's some states and some workers, and many teachers, I think. Okay, so let's think about what not being fully funded means. Another way of just thinking about it is, it just means state and local governments have implicit debt, right? And so one way to think about it is, a less than fully funded plan is like a fully funded plan and implicit debt. And you could actually think about making the implicit debt explicit debt. So imagine that state and local governments just borrowed the amount that they needed to make the plan fully funded, right? So the plan has 35% of their liabilities. They borrow 65%. The plan's now fully funded and they have debt. What does that mean? It means that they can use the money from the plan to pay benefits, and then they also have to use the money to pay the interest cost on the debt. That's basically what we're doing. We're saying it's like having explicit debt, and we're kind of treating it that way. And once you see it that way, you're like, okay, well, governments have debt. That's not unusual, and it's not a big deal. And so this idea that not being fully funded means that you're in a crisis doesn't really follow. It means state and local governments actually have a bit more debt than we thought they did, or maybe a lot more debt than we thought they did. But governments can have debt, and they don't ever have to pay off the debt. They just have to make the interest payments. They can just keep rolling it over. That's what's different between a government and like a household. When they borrow, have to pay off the debt. But the federal debt is just constantly rolled over. State and local debts can be constantly rolled over. And that's why it's not necessarily a crisis to have debt. It just means you have these payments that you have to make on the debt. Okay. What does going to full funding mean? So if you were not fully funded and then you went to full funding, it's saying like, I have debt and I'm going to fully pay it off, right? And one of the things that we think is really important to note is that this implicit pension debt is not new, right? Even using the actuaries' assumed rates of return, plans have almost never been fully funded. Using the riskless rates of return that finance economists suggest should be used, they've never been fully funded, not never. So in some sense, current taxpayers have just inherited the debt. And if you decided to say, oh, we really should be fully funded, that would be like making current taxpayers pay a lot to help future taxpayers, right? So it would say, well, we have this big debt, let's put it all on the next 30 years of taxpayers to help the future taxpayers pay less. Since they've all inherited a debt, a more sort of natural way to think about spreading the costs of the debt is to just say, well, let's all share the debt, right? We're going to spread it over our generation and the next generations. And the way you do that is you say, just make sure the debt is constant as a share of GDP, right? So each generation is going to pay enough interest on the debt to keep it from rising as a share of GDP. That's basically what our analysis does. It says, imagine that's what you want. You want to spread the costs over the debt over time. What do you need to do? Okay. So as I said before, what we do is to say, look, we know they've effectively long been partially funded. So we want to see, well, we said being partially funded doesn't mean you necessarily can't be sustainable. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't pay your benefits. So let's test to see if you can. If you can't, when are the plans likely to run out of money? Is it next year, 5 years, 20 years? That sort of tells you how urgent the problem is and what changes are required to make them sustainable, okay? And I think more broadly, why we call it a public finance approach is we're making this sort of recognizing it's just government debt. We're not treating it as something special, as, oh, something different about pension. It's just like part of the government portfolio. They've got assets, they've got obligations, they've got Medicaid in the future, they've got tax revenues in the future. We're just putting it in the mix and looking at sort of government, like pension obligations, just like other government spending. For the federal government, you've all seen, I'm sure, the Congressional Budget Office projections annual cash flows estimates for revenues and for spending. And we're going to do the same thing for the state and local pensions. Okay. As a preview on our conclusions, under low and moderate asset returns, which I'll talk to you about in a second, they're actually not currently sustainable. At higher rates of return, they are, mostly, not every plan, but most plans. Plans can be stabilized, especially at this moderate asset return, with what we think are moderate fiscal adjustments, much lower than what would be required to be fully funded. And there's not really a huge rush. There's only modest returns to stabilizing immediately versus in the future. And in some cases, which I'll show you, you actually want to wait. And of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity across the plans, and some plans are far from stable. Okay, what do we do? I'm going to go quickly because we're not going to have a lot of time. We basically do this analysis by going into incredible detail into these actuarial reports about what each plan's rules are and what the rules are for existing employees and for new hires and what the COLA rules are. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and we do these projections and we compare them what do the actuaries do to make sure that we're doing a good job. And so we only have 40 plans because it's very labor intensive to do what we do, but we chose the 40 plans so that they matched the aggregates. So we compare our sample to the national sample in this public plans database, which is from that Boston Retirement Center I told you about. We match it on all kinds of things. So we feel pretty good that when we put our plans together, that's basically telling you what the national aggregates are. Okay. Okay. Oh, and then what we do, which nobody else does, is we want to look at these things on an ongoing basis. So we're saying, well, we have a bunch of current hire employees. We know who they are, but we also know that there'll be new hires going forward. So we say, assume that employment in the state and local sector matches employment in the state, which is going to be matching employment growth, population growth in the state, which we have state by state. And then we sort of just simulate by adding new hires. And so we keep these pension plans going in perpetuity. So this is what it looks like. And the first thing we wanted to see was, like, is this like Social Security? We know there's a demographic transition in Social Security that's going to make plans harder, right? Put Social Security out of whack. Is that what's going on in state and local? And so this is the ratio of beneficiaries in these state and local plans to the workforce in the plans. And you can see this ratio of beneficiaries to workforce increases quite a bit, about 30%, 6% over the next decades. It looks very similar to what we expect for Social Security. So we have that same demographic transition happening, which we expected in these pension plans as in Social Security and in society as large. As the population is aging, they're not hiring as many people, and therefore the ratio of beneficiaries to workers is increasing. But what was really surprising to us is that we looked at the ratio of not the people, but the benefits that they're getting. And that isn't rising the way Social Security is rising. Our benefits only rise 5% over the next 2 decades, and then they decline. Social Security rises about 28% and doesn't decline, and then kind of starts to crawl up over time. So this means that plans are going to eventually get fiscal relief. The benefits are going down over time. And that says governments may want to smooth through them. If I know there's a big surge in benefits for a while, but then it goes down, I'm going to not want to like raise contributions that much. I'm going to say, well, let's sort of use our assets for a while to stabilize or even borrow. Okay. So why is this? What like this really surprised us, this picture. And so what we basically did is sort of try to figure out what things could be going on. And we explained most of it, not all of it, but most of it. So the way we explained it to say, look, Social Security pays cost of living increases to beneficiaries. A lot of pension plans don't. And in fact, in the last 10 years, a lot of pension plans have changed their COLAs. And so one of the things that people have recognized in some states, even though you can't change the benefit formula for existing hires, you have to pay them this benefit. You don't have to pay them the COLA. You actually can change the COLA for existing employees, even existing retirees. You can say, this year we're not doing a COLA. And so a lot of plans don't have a COLA or only have like half of the CPI increase or 1% a year, all kinds of different rules. And then on top of that, plans have made very, very large changes to benefits for new hires. So they can't change the benefit rules for the existing workers, but they can for new hires, and they've done that a lot. So we said, imagine that they had none of these new hire reforms starting from, today on. And then the COLA was equal to inflation, right? So imagine that everybody who's now a worker gets the same benefits as the ones who have the most generous benefits who are still working, and the COLA is inflation. And if you do that, you kind of match the Social Security. It's not quite as large, but it's much, much larger. And you see, because lack of COLAs make sort of they're compounded over time, and the new hire reforms take a long time to really show up. You can see that you get these massive differences in the long run. Instead of going up over time, it goes down from like 1.65% of GDP to like 1.45. So this is the explanation that we've come up with. And this really means you have to think about this quite differently than Social Security. Okay, I'm going to run out of time. So I'm going to quickly tell you what our sustainability analysis is. We're saying we're doing something very similar like we do for the federal budget. So plans are putting in a certain amount of payroll right now. Actually, in 2017, when this was all based from, they're putting a certain percent of payroll into their plans. Imagine they just do that every year, right? So they don't change their contributions, and we just analyze the cash flows going forward. How much is coming in? How much is going out? And what happens to their assets? Are they going to run out of assets? And be on this ever path of sort of going more negative and more negative. To do that, we have to have an assumption about the rate of return on assets. That's a really, really complicated, controversial question. Should you do this sustainability analysis with assuming that assets get this risk-free rate of return? So imagine they put all their money in treasuries, because no, they don't do that. But when they put their money in stocks, it's really risky. And so you shouldn't count the higher return. You shouldn't count on it. And so you can count on the treasury rate of return. So let's do that. There's a whole bunch of arguments about why you would or wouldn't want to do that beyond the scope of the paper. So we do three things. We say we're going to use the risk-free rate of return, which is the treasury. We think that's really low and probably too low, especially because the rate of return right now is extremely low. It's basically 0% real. So inflation adjusted, it's like you get no return on your assets. And that's not something that we think is going to persist. And we also think it's not all about risk, but we do it. We do the 5% return, much, much higher, which is kind of what the actuaries assume. And it's about what plans have received since 2000, right? So this is kind of the expected rate of return. And then we do something in between, which is really just halfway in between to say, well, you can make arguments that 0 is too low and 5 is too high. Maybe something in between is kind of a reasonable. And it's, again, beyond, and don't worry about the CBO. We also did the CBO rate of return, but let's just think about the three. Okay, so this is looking at assets to GDP. And so if you are spending out way more than you have, you're going to be depleting your assets. If you're not, your assets are going to be increasing. So if you take this expected rate of return at 5%, plans in the aggregate are just fine, actually. They're not going to exhaust their assets. In fact, they're doing too much, right? Which makes sense, because what plans actually do is to say, I want to get fully funded in 30 years, and I'm going to put in enough to do that. And they assume this kind of 5% rate of return. And so that means that they're actually planning on building up their assets. And if they keep doing that, even after they're fully funded, they're just going to keep increasing forever. If you take these lower rates of return, then you do run out of assets. At 0, you run out of assets in about 30 years in the aggregate, and at 2.5, about 45 years. So it's not as if an aggregate plans are exhausting their assets really soon. Some plans are. One plan, in fact, New Jersey is, but it's not as if they're stable at these lower rates of return. At the 5%, they're fine.
Let me ask you could go back to that one. Let me ask a dumb question here.
Yeah.
The brown line, the 0% real return, at the end ends up higher than the lines for the 2.5 or the CBO rates.
Yes.
How is that?
Okay, so I will get to that before, but I'll tell you about it now. So there's something kind of crazy about these 0% rates of return. If you've heard about this whole question about people saying, do we have to worry about the debt now that interest rates are so low? It really is the mirror of that. To keep assets constant as a share of GDP, assets have to grow with GDP, right? When rates of return are 0%, that's less than GDP growth. So if I have assets and they're not giving me any return, but my GDP is growing and I want my assets to grow, I have to take taxpayer money just to put in the assets, just to keep up with GDP. And so when your assets earn such a low rate of return, you are actually better off in this kind of sense being pay as you go. Assets are costly. They're not giving you anything. Like, you could use them up, so that's good, right? And they're good for risk protection because you can use them up. But if you want to actually like keep them at a level, I want to have my assets 20% of GDP, it's really hard to do when interest rates are this low. And that is the converse of the argument you hear at the federal level, which is debt is not costly when interest rates are this low, because even if you don't pay any interest, if the interest rates are 0 and GDP is growing, debt falls all by itself as a share of GDP. So this is all about that conversation of how long can interest rates be below the rate of growth of GDP, because it's kind of really turns everything you ever thought around in terms of sustainability. So I don't know if that explains it, but, and I think I have a little bit more on the slides after, but I didn't think I'd have time to really go through that, but that is really what's going on. So, and happy to talk more about it if anybody wants to, because it is sort of it's not just about pensions, it's just about in general, like it's not something you hear about the debt all the time. Okay.
Let me just pause for a second. We got a couple questions coming in on the rate of return expectations.
Yeah.
And I just want to keep ahead, keep watch on the clock. It's 11:37. We'll go to 11:55. So if we have a bunch of questions, let me know now. But if you can kind of maybe aim to be getting through the presentation, after this question in like 5 minutes or so.
I can do that.
Okay, so Laura from the Dayton Daily News asks, Ohio's 5 systems have assumed rates of return between 7 and 7.75, a long way from 5%. How much of a problem is that? That Ethan says they're doing the same in New Hampshire. Let
me just clarify. So our rates of return are inflation adjusted.
Okay.
So 5 is basically 7.
Got it.
Okay. 7.5, depending on what you think the inflation is going to be. This is a CPI 2.2, 2.3, so like 7.3. So that's why we say the 5 is kind of what places are doing. Okay. So we do these 2 exercises. One is to say, look, this is like long run stability says, imagine that you just stabilize your debt. I don't care what level, but do something now. I raise my contribution today and forevermore so that we will now be able to pay benefits in perpetuity, never have to touch anything again. The other way to say it is, well, I don't want to do such long run things because who knows what's going to happen in the long run. So let's just say whatever your debt to GDP ratio is today, and this is this implicit debt, sort of this unfunded liabilities relative to GDP. Let's say, make sure in 30 years it's no bigger. So that's a little bit more of a constrained exercise. And then we calculate what you have to do. So if you want to stabilize the implicit debt in the long run, you have to, at a 2.5% rate of return, raise contributions 8% of payroll. That's a little bit less than what they've done already in the past 10 years. It's not nothing, but it's not crisis level, okay? If you wait 30 years, you say, I don't do anything for 30 years. I totally ignore the problem. So I let my assets go down. I just do nothing. And then in 30 years, I'm saying, ooh, now I want to stabilize. Then you have to do a bit more, but not a lot more. Then you're going from 8 to 10. So you get 30 years of not doing anything, and you have to go to 10 in the long run. So this is our view that 1, it's not that huge. And 2, it's not so, if you have other priorities right now, fine, focus on those priorities, right? At 0, it's different, it's bigger, it's more like 15% today. But here's this thing coming up again. The longer you delay, the better off you are. And that's because the longer you delay, the lower your assets, and assets are costly when interest rates are below the growth rate of the economy. So it's this kind of counterintuitive thing that if you actually took 0 seriously, you would have to say, well, I don't even want assets. So you kind of have like, well, the interest rates are high, I'm okay. And if they're really low, I'm not okay, I have to do a lot, but I'm happy to wait. I don't actually think 0 is the right rate, but some people do. Like the finance economists who reviewed this say, oh, well, we're obviously going to choose 0. I don't. So, and like, as I said, we don't solve that problem in this paper. So if you do the second exercise and you say, well, I don't want to stabilize forever, I want to make sure we hit today's implicit debt ratio. If you start today, you have to do almost the same, not quite as much. If you wait, it's bigger. And that's because if you wait, you're going to get less funded. And we're going to say, no, you got to get back to today's rate. So then you have to sort of pay off some of the debt that you allow yourself to accumulate over time, but still not that massively different. Let me just skip ahead. Here's the real key, which is the full funding requires much, much larger adjustments. So if I wanted to be fully funded in 30 years at a 2.5% rate of return, I have to increase my contributions starting today, 36% of payroll. And if I wait 30 years, it's going to be 46% of payroll, the thing to the far right in that 2.5% column. If I assume the rate of return is 0, I have to increase my contributions by 60% today to be fully funded. That goes up over time because I'm saying you have to be fully funded. And so you've got to like just keep on making up more. And boy, getting to fully funded when you get no return on your assets is really hard, right? Because you put money in and it's not doing anything for you. It's not growing. You have to keep more and more and more and more. And so if you compare it, it's 7 versus 35. That's the difference about being fully funded in 30 years versus saying, let's just make sure debt is the same. Okay, so we have stuff in the paper. Did you send them the link to the paper? I actually don't have it on here. If anybody wants the paper, I'll give it to Chris and he can send it around to you guys if you want it. If you look and say, well, which plans have to do a lot and which plans have to do a little, because of this thing that we're doing about saying you just need to stabilize, the percent funding doesn't really have much of an impact on how much you have to do. So some of these plans like Illinois that we know are really poorly funded and New Jersey actually don't have to do much more. This is at 0. That's particularly true because assets are bad at 0. You might have thought, well, the poorly funded plans are putting nothing in. So of course they have to do the most, not because they're less funded, but because they put no contributions in. But that's not the case. Many of these plans actually have made really, really large changes. Like New Jersey got rid of their COLA. Illinois, new hires get very, very low benefits. So what we look at here is, this is the effect of plan changes and contribution increases since 2007 on what you would have to do to stabilize. So we're sort of comparing what you would have to do if you hadn't made those changes. And this is what you have to do now. And so the plans that don't have to do very much now can actually lower their contribution are the ones that have made these huge changes. Now, the thing that I don't show you here that we should be showing is that some of these plans like Illinois actually get rid of all their assets and they borrow. So in this world of ours, Illinois is going to say, look, I have a bunch of benefits to pay now, but in the future, I've got all this space because I don't have to pay much benefit. So I can use the money that I would have gone to pay benefits in the future to pay interest on debt. So they're like, let's borrow, get through this big period of expenses, and then we'll have plenty of money to pay the debt. So you might say, well, from a kind of perspective of pensions, that's not okay. And in the next version of the paper, we're going to show what this looks like if we say, no, they have to be at least as funded in the future as they have to be now. But we think this is a valid perspective. Okay, my quick takeaways. You can't equate less than full funding with sustainability, right? You do not have to be fully funded in order to be completely sustainable. At expected, not risk-adjusted rates of return, plans are not fully funded, but they are basically sustainable. I looked at 5% return, only 6 of our 40 plans ever exhaust their assets, and mostly not for a long time, except for New Jersey. At lower rates of return, plans are on average unsustainable, which means their debt is rising over time. At a 2.5% real rate of return, yes, they're unsustainable, but it's pretty moderate what they have to do. It's not a crisis. With a 0% rate of return, the adjustments are larger, but it's also true that at 0% return, you don't even want assets. And so you should wait in some sense, if that's what you believe. If you think rates of return are 0 are going to stay that way, you should wait. And then more broadly, this next slide isn't really about the paper, but the way I like to think about it and the way I want this to be just one of the considerations that a state and local government has, and just to think about it as debt, is that you really want to think about why we would want to lower implicit debt, right? So Pension funding is really about intergenerational equity. Why do we care about how well funded they are? The same reasons we care about whether or not the federal government has too much debt. We're worried about future taxpayers. Are we sticking taxpayers with this big bill? Are there going to be huge tax increases in the future because the pensions are not going to be able to pay their benefits and the states and local governments are going to have to raise taxes? So when you think about it that way, governments have a choice. How am I going to improve this the economic well-being of the next generation? They can use taxpayer monies to put the money in pensions. Say, well, one of the things I want to do is not leave them with this big bill on pensions. Or I can say, well, maybe if I put the money in education or climate resilience or improving the health, particularly of kids, I'm going to do better than that. And they should be thinking about that trade-off. If I'm trying to protect future taxpayers, I want to invest in whichever of these has the higher social rate of return, which is best for my future taxpayers. Because state and local governments have borrowing constraints, they can't just borrow to invest in education, but they can do it by not fully funding their pension. Not fully funding your pensions is a way of just borrowing to finance education. If I'm doing this big increase in education, to me, it seems like a perfect thing to borrow for. The benefits are in the future. It has huge benefits. And so I just think that I'm not saying you should always don't fund your pension, fund your education, but you should think about that. You should make that decision. And the other thing that it's not on this slide, but one of the things that I think has changed in economics a lot in the last 10 to 15 years is with the use of big data, we have a lot of very, very high quality evidence that things like investing in preschool, giving money to poor families, getting children health care actually has these huge rates of return, right? Wages are higher, educational attainment is higher, crime is lower, all the dimensions of society improve if you invest in kids and particularly in poor families. So our kind of larger thing is to say, when you're a state and local government deciding how much to put in your pension plan, think about what you're not doing when you do that and weigh those trade-offs. All right.
So we have time for a few questions. Ethan?
I can stop sharing.
Yeah,
Hi there.
Ethan,
My name is Ethan. I'm a reporter in New Hampshire. My internet isn't very good, so let me know if you can't hear me.
Great.
Okay, great. So we have lowered our projected rate of returns. We did an actuarial analysis that came out last year. We lowered it from 7.75% to 6.75%. And I've been asking about that. There've been about why that happened. One reason has been given is demographic changes, people aging, as you kind of mentioned. But another reason is just way lower than expected investment returns in the last 3 years. And that's something that's a little puzzling to me. They said that this is something that's happening across the country, but I thought up until the pandemic that, the 2 years before that were very good years for the stock market. And so I'm a little perplexed as to why it seems to not have been that way for pension plans. And that's sort of the reason that our state officials have been giving. Is that something that is seen nationally, and what is behind that?
Yeah, so I mean, you can have some very, very good years. The market has done pretty well, but it hasn't on average done as well over the past 10 years now or 12 years as plans have been assuming. So you can sort of look at history and, a 6% rate of return, 4% real is pretty good still. And so so you had sort of some terrible years and then some great years. Now we've had a really, really great year. Surprisingly so. So that changed a little. I think more broadly, there's been a big recognition that when you look at many rates of return, they have been coming down over time, really since 1980. And so when we say treasuries have come down to zero, we kind of think it's not just about treasuries. It's about rates of return in general. And this demographic argument is going to be like, well, if you don't have a lot of new workers coming on because of demographics, then there's only so much new equipment you can give those workers. So like if you're saving a lot, then you're like giving these workers all this new equipment, it has sort of low productivity. There's a lot of reasons that people think rates of return have come down, but it's not just about government borrowing costs. It's really about the rate of return on capital. Productivity growth is low. That makes rates of return lower. But the thing is, we're economists are not really good at projecting these things. So these are projections. The market expects rates to remain really, really low, which means that they also expect the real return on stock market to be lower. So they all move together. All these rates are kind of going to move together. You might say, well, the stock market earns 4 or 5% more than treasuries. So when treasuries fall, the expected rate of return on the stock market falls as well. So plans have started to take that into account, but not a lot. So that they've moved only a little. But it's also true that like plans have been putting a lot of money into pensions, but given their expectations on their assets returns, they're not any better funded than they were 10 years ago. It's kind of puzzling, but it's because really rates of return have been pretty good, but not as good as they've been expecting.
Okay, so Stacy, and tell her where you're from.
Sure. So my name is Stacy Barchinger. I'm a reporter for the Bergen Record and the Gannett Papers in New Jersey. I am curious, is there a connection, and sorry, this is probably such a basic question, but is there a connection between pension fundedness and a state's credit rating? And if so, how much weight should policymakers be giving to the impact on the credit rating when they decide how much to put into the pension?
Right. So one of the things that we don't have in this sustainability analysis is this idea that maybe your rates, your borrowing costs on your debt could change as you put more money into pension. So that is a consideration. And it is. And again, and that's another thing is just let's look at the whole picture. Let's look at your real debt and let's look at your pension debt and let's look at the picture of the state as a whole instead of just focusing on the pension. That again is what we want to do. You know, we presented this paper 2 years ago and somebody was from Moody's was our discussant, and he said, yeah, we really care about funding and all this stuff. But then again, all these states have really good ratings, right? Almost all these states. So they recognize the sustainability, I think, this question that like, yeah, they have to make some small adjustments, but don't just look at this unfunded number and let it scare you. And frankly, they don't really take the 0% that seriously. That's more like the academic perspective, right? Because we're saying like, look, if they get reasonable rates of return, maybe 5 is a little high. Maybe we should have done it at 4. If they get 4% on average over time, yeah, they'll have some bad years and they'll have some good years, but they will be okay in the long run. If you take it from a purely pension perspective, you're like, oh, but they might run out of assets. That would be disastrous. If you think broader, like, yeah, they could run out of assets, but the state could like then just like supplement and borrow, or you know, and so there's a lot more latitude. And they could raise taxes if they have to. You know, it's not like, oh, we go bankrupt. The state has huge taxing capacity, and that changes how you think about it too. But yeah, that is definitely a consideration, and ratings agencies definitely look at it. Let me say one last thing is ratings agencies claim they will also like do those calculations to say, well, you didn't put money in your pension, but you did fund education. And so we think you're a better prospect in the future. I don't know how much they actually do that. They claim they do. And because that is really the right thing. And actually there's like evidence that says when you raise money, when you raise investment in education, like your house prices go up. So you can kind of see it almost automatically in terms of your revenue streams. And so maybe they do take that into account.
Okay, and with that, I think we'll draw this to a close. I don't see any other hands up, but Louise has been very accessible. So if you want to reach out to her to kind of go over the implications of her research on the 40 different plans that they looked at, and if they were ones that you cover, you know, that's I'm sure you can touch base with her. I have asked Jonathan Diaz to come talk with us about voting rights. I know voting rights is one of those topics that a lot of you are covering on an ongoing basis. So I've asked Jonathan to come do 2 things. One, kind of put it in, you know, develop the big picture context. So a lot of you are covering what's going on in your states. I've asked him to kind of talk about what's the lay of the land, what are the number of voting rights legislative actions going on, and you know, what kinds of restrictions are they? You know, what have courts said about those kind of things in the past? So I'm asking him to kind of give the big picture national overview that you can put your states in context. And also he's an expert who's in the thick of this. And so I'm guessing that a lot of you will have state specific questions that he might be able to answer in the Q&A session. So Jonathan works for the Campaign Legal Center as legal counsel for voting rights. He litigates voting rights cases in federal courts and challenges state laws and policies that deny, abridge, or otherwise burden the right to vote. The Campaign Legal Center, if that's not an organization you're familiar with, is a very good organization to know. I've dealt with them a lot in the past on campaign finance issues, and they have some of the best experts that you can go to find about the legal status of challenges on campaign finance issues. And then they also have a voting rights division, which is what Jonathan is from. So Jonathan, I will turn it over to you. We have him until 11:50, so he'll present and he'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So Jonathan, welcome.
Great, thank you, Chris. It's great to be here with all of you. I recognize a lot of your names from your work, but really happy to be here to talk to you all today about the flood of election legislation that is moving through many of the state houses that you all cover. So my plan for this first half is to talk sort of in general terms about the legal background of election law, policy, administration, with a particular focus on how state level election laws and policies interact with the federal system and federal courts, and then get a little bit more specific into what we are seeing right now in 2021 in state legislatures in terms of legislation affecting the right to vote, and put that both in a historical context as well as just a national present day context. So I'm going to start with the US Constitution. The Elections Clause of the Constitution gives state legislatures the primary responsibility to set the times, places, and manners of holding elections for federal office. But it also explicitly grants Congress the authority to, at any time by law, make or alter such regulations. So in the Constitution, in this explicit grant of lawmaking authority when it comes to elections, the system is designed to have states do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to setting rules about eligibility and the process of voting, but those rules are subject to limitations and guidelines provided by the Constitution and federal voting laws. So they have to comply with a number of amendments. Many people, I think, don't realize that the Constitution does not anywhere in its text affirmatively state anything about the right to vote. That is not an explicitly granted right in the Constitution. It is something that has been interpreted by the courts and has been sort of read into the Constitution. But there are more amendments to the United States Constitution having to do with the electoral process than any other subject. So that is everything from the First Amendment, which, as I'm sure you all know, protects freedom of speech, freedom of the press, et cetera. The courts have interpreted voting as politically expressive conduct protected by the First Amendment. The 14th Amendment's due process and equal protection provisions apply to voting. The 15th Amendment outlaws race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment provides for the direct election of senators by the people. Prior to that, they were appointed by state legislatures in many cases. The 19th Amendment prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in voting. The 24th Amendment outlaws poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment prohibits age discrimination in voting for Americans over the age of 18. So all of those constitutional provisions provide, the outer boundaries of what states are permitted to do when it comes to administering their elections. They impose limitations. Some of those are pretty self-evident. You can't pass a law that says, only men can vote, or only white people can vote. That's what the 15th and 19th Amendments were intended to address. But there are also a number of federal election statutes that either set minimum standards that the states have to comply with, outlaw certain voting laws and policies that the federal government has determined to be discriminatory or otherwise unlawful, or require uniformity to some degree or another across the states. So the most famous of those is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, passed at the peak of the Civil Rights Movement. But that also includes things like the National Voter Registration Act, which was passed in 1993, sometimes called the Motor Voter Law, which requires states that have voter registration systems to let voters register at the DMV when they get their driver's license. HAVA, or the Help America Vote Act, which was passed in the wake of the 2000 election and the Bush v. Gore decision. And then UOCAVA, which is the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, which sets uniform rules for Americans living abroad, either serving in the military or in the diplomatic corps, or who just are not in the jurisdiction of the United States during an election. Some non-voting specific federal laws also govern the conduct of elections. Things like the Americans with Disabilities Act requires places like polling places to be accessible to folks with disabilities. And the Civil Rights Act of 1871, also called the KKK Act, has provisions that have to do with outlawing voter intimidation and private parties preventing people from casting their votes or having their votes counted. I want to talk in a little bit more detail about the Voting Rights Act in particular, because that is one that sort of most directly touches on a lot of the election legislation that we're seeing proposed today and that we've seen proposed over the years. There are two main pieces of the VRA. The first is Section 2, which outlaws any test or device requirement for registration or voting. So it specifically bans things like literacy tests, which were common in the Jim Crow South, for example. And it also prohibits voting qualifications, prerequisites, standards, processes, procedures that result in the denial or abridgment of the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or membership in a language minority group. To pull a recent example, many of the lawsuits, I think all of the lawsuits that have been filed so far challenging the most recent Georgia election legislation bring claims under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So they allege that this new bill has a racially disparate impact and is connected to historical discrimination in the voting context. Section 2 and the Voting Rights Act include a lot of other provisions, things like allowing language minority access to voters who don't speak English. It prohibits racial gerrymandering, or the drawing of legislative and congressional district lines to dilute minority voters' voting power. It prohibits residency requirements of more than 30 days to register to vote in a state. It outlaws voter fraud and double voting and has a voter intimidation provision. So it's a pretty robust set of protections targeted at many of the types of laws and policies that were used to deny the franchise to particularly voters of color in the 1950s and 60s especially. So those provisions remain in effect. And we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like as far as litigation and challenging these laws in court. But the other major piece of the Voting Rights Act was Section 5 and the pre-clearance regime, which, as some of you might know, was invalidated by the Supreme Court in 2013 in the Shelby County versus Holder decision. So prior to that, a number of states, either in whole or in part, were required to submit any changes to their election laws or policies to the Justice Department or to a federal court in the District of DC for pre-approval before those laws could be implemented. And the reason for that was that those were jurisdictions that had shown a consistent pattern or history of racial discrimination in voting. Many of the formerly covered jurisdictions that were subject to this pre-clearance process were in the Deep South and were part of the old Confederacy. But it also included many political subdivisions, counties, cities, townships in the North or in the West that had significant language minority populations and similarly troubling histories of discrimination in voting. So for those of you who are covering states that were formerly covered by the pre-clearance provision, it's important to contextualize the legislative activity that's taking place today with, the fact that that pre-clearance process is no longer in effect. So a state like Georgia or Texas both of which were covered by preclearance prior to Shelby County, would have had to submit all of these changes that they are proposing in their legislatures to the Justice Department or to a federal judge before they would have been able to pass a law or implement a new policy. So just so you all know, since I know you're all from all over the place, the formerly covered jurisdictions in their entirety are Alaska, Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, and Virginia. And then states that were partially covered, so they had some counties that were subject to preclearance, or townships, depending on how their states are organized, are California, Florida, South Dakota, North Carolina, Michigan, New Hampshire, and New York. And because of certain federal requirements, like the NVRA, for example, with the National Voter Registration Act requires registration laws and policies to be uniform across the state. If it's for a state like Florida, for example, where I'm from, since a couple of counties were subject to preclearance, but voter registration has to be uniform across the state, effectively, any statewide change, since it affected those counties, would have also been subject to preclearance. So in 2013, the Supreme Court, in the Shelby County versus Holder decision, held that the formula for determining which states were subject to preclearance was unconstitutional. And so it essentially, the preclearance process and the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act still exist, but no jurisdiction is covered under that formula. And so federal proposals like the John Lewis Voting Rights Authorization Act would reinstate a new preclearance formula. But we can talk more about federal proposals later on. Sure.
Yeah, Jonathan, we have one question, one hand raised right now. If we could just take a few questions as we go through, but we'll mostly keep them at the end. But Stephen Gruber Miller of the Des Moines Register raised his hand. What's your question, Stephen?
Hey, thanks. I just wanted to ask if you had thoughts. I mean, you're talking about the connection of some of these new laws and the result from the Shelby County decision. I wonder how much you feel like we can attribute some of this wave of voting legislation to the repeal or to the striking down of that portion. And I ask this as an Iowan who is not in a covered jurisdiction, but Iowa has followed the trend that we've seen really in a lot of states that were covered and were not covered of voter ID laws and other sort of stricter rules. So I'm wondering how much you think there's a connection to the Shelby County decision when we're seeing changes in states that were and were not covered.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think that from my perspective, there is, I think, a pretty direct link between the Shelby County decision and just the volume of voting changes that we are seeing, particularly in the covered jurisdictions. But as I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, these proposals, these changes that we're seeing are really part of a nationwide trend. And so when additional voting restrictions can gain momentum by being passed in states like Alabama and Texas and Louisiana, then you see them kind of bleeding over into non-covered jurisdictions like Iowa. And so to give some concrete examples, in the immediate aftermath of the Shelby County decision, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights did a report that showed that between 2012 and 2018, the report was done in 2018, there was a total reduction of more than 1,100 polling places in formerly covered jurisdictions, many of them in areas with high concentrations of Black and Latino voters, predominantly in Georgia, Texas, and Arizona. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund also released a report in 2017 called Democracy Diminished that kind of goes state by state through the covered jurisdictions and shows what laws or policies were immediately passed or implemented, in some cases in the very day after the Shelby County decision was released. So I think that there is a really clear through line between how aggressive state legislators are willing to be when it comes to passing or implementing these voting restrictions in the wake of Shelby in a way that they wouldn't have been in, say, 2010 before the decision was passed or came down rather. And I think I saw more chat questions pop up.
Yeah, so we have one question. This would be good to get into right now from Ethan,
Sure.
who is from New Hampshire. Could you give some clarity as to why certain states were partially covered by pre-clearance decisions? I'm reporting from New Hampshire, and I didn't realize that we were part of it.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure about New Hampshire in particular, but I know that in several of the states that were partially covered, it had to do with large populations of language minorities. There's a separate section of the Voting Rights Act that mandates that any jurisdiction that has a certain percentage of non-English language speakers, primary speakers, has to provide voting information in that language. So, for example, in some of the covered counties in South Dakota, I believe it had to do with Native American language minority voters in those jurisdictions. So I'm not sure about New Hampshire in particular. There was also a sort of complicated process of having jurisdictions could be bailed in to preclearance as a remedy for losing a voting rights lawsuit. So the Justice Department often requested that federal courts, subject a jurisdiction that they sued for a Voting Rights Act violation to preclearance going forward. And if the Justice Department ultimately prevailed in that case, then sometimes the courts would require that a jurisdiction be subject to preclearance for a certain amount of time. So with all of that background, I guess a little bit more table setting, and then I'll get into 2021. So just some things for you all to keep in mind as far as federal requirements. The National Voter Registration Act, like I mentioned, requires voter registration laws and policies to be uniform across a state, so that different counties can't have different voter registration requirements. It also has pretty detailed process guidelines for how voters can be removed from registration rolls. So when you hear about things like voter purges or attempts by election administrators to conduct list maintenance and clean up their voter registration rolls, they have to do so in a way that complies with the process laid out in the NVRA to make sure that they're not removing too many eligible voters from the rolls erroneously. And then things like UOCAVA and the ADA impose similar process requirements and give specific standards that they have to meet for things like when they have to send absentee ballots to overseas voters, or how to make a polling place accessible under the ADA. Maintenance and purge are not one-to-one interchangeable terms. I think both get thrown around by advocates and election officials in the voting space, depending on whether they want to make voter list activity sound nefarious or benign. The way that I would characterize it is that a voter purge is anytime that an election official or administrator conducts an effort to remove a large number of voters from the rolls outside of their normal process, or using a process that has a high risk of erroneously removing eligible voters from the rolls. And then list maintenance, I would describe as a more routine process, for example, of removing deceased voters from the rolls based on information from the Social Security Agency or county officials that track that sort of data. And so you'll hear proponents of more aggressive list maintenance policies describe any policy that removes voters from the registration rolls as it's just list maintenance. And folks who are more concerned about eligible voters being removed from the rolls will be more likely to characterize a process like that as a purge. And so it really is just kind of, they're both descriptive terms used by advocates in one sense or another. But I think from my perspective, whether a process is routine or sort of ad hoc, if it is conducted in a way that uses stale data, for example, from a driver's license agency or a healthcare agency that might not have, that might present a higher risk of erroneous removal from the rolls, I would characterize that as a purge. But not all list maintenance activity. Everybody wants accurate voter rolls. Are there any legitimate reasons to remove from the voting rolls people who haven't voted in a long time? That is a great question. I don't believe that inactivity should be a basis for removal from the voter rolls. There was a fairly recent Supreme Court case, a Philip Randolph Institute versus Husted, in which the Supreme Court held that the NVRA does not prohibit removal from the voter rolls on the basis of inactivity, provided that election officials make an effort to contact voters to determine whether they have moved or died or become ineligible for some reason. I think that there are a lot of implementation problems with systems like that. Often election officials will send postcards to a voter's registration residence, and if the voter doesn't respond and hasn't voted in 2 general election cycles, then they can be removed or placed on inactive status. I don't know about you, I don't respond to every postcard that I receive in the mail from, that I didn't request. So, there have been studies conducted by folks like Demos that show that this non-contact process is not a super accurate way to determine whether a voter has moved or is no longer ineligible. And, we don't have compulsory voting in the United States. Voters may not vote for a whole number of reasons. Anything from being dissatisfied with the candidates that they're presented to not having sufficient opportunities to vote because they work multiple jobs, and absentee and early voting may be limited in their jurisdiction. So it's a fraught process. So I don't think inactivity is a particularly good metric for elected administrators to use when removing people from the rolls. But I do want to talk about the current ongoing election legislation that's happening all across the country. And I know that many of you who are covering state houses, I think that's all of you, are probably much more familiar than I am with what's going on in your particular states. But to give kind of the big picture overview, just yesterday, actually, the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU updated their count of pending election legislation. It is up to 361 bills that the Brennan Center has characterized as restrictive or anti-voter in some way that have been introduced in 47 states, which is, as you know, almost all of them. That's an overwhelmingly high number. And to go back to the question that Stephen asked earlier, I don't think we would be seeing this kind of volume of election legislation being even proposed, but for the Shelby County decision, making it easier for states to pass potentially discriminatory or restrictive laws without any federal oversight or pre-approval. Many of these bills, as you guys know, will never actually become law, but some of them already have. I think at least 5 bills have passed in Arkansas, Georgia, Iowa, and Utah, and at least 29 have already passed through at least one chamber of their state legislatures in other states. And now that we are really in the thick of the legislative session in many states, things are moving through committees and starting to be scheduled for floor votes. So most of the restrictions that we are seeing these days have focus on the absentee ballot process, which for a long time, I don't think was the subject of any kind of particular controversy because most voters liked absentee voting kind of across the political spectrum. But during the 2020 election, partisan lines were drawn in the sand about absentee and mail voting, and former President Trump and his campaign and many of his allies made it a political strategy to really cast doubt on the legitimacy and the security of absentee and mail voting. And so now we are seeing sort of a backlash to the overwhelming use of vote by mail and absentee voting in states across the country because of the pandemic that data and polling have shown were overwhelmingly utilized by Democratic leaning voters in 2020. And so now many Republican controlled legislatures are seeking to restrict access to absentee voting. Where, in many of those states, absentee voting bills, including no excuse absentee, were originally introduced and passed by those same Republican legislators. In states like Arizona and Florida, Republican voters and Republican campaigns tended to really emphasize voting by mail because older voters really like vote by mail, and older voters tend to skew more Republican. And so this kind of partisan realignment around absentee and mail voting is something new. And it's really motivated and connected to the same kinds of conspiracy theories and misinformation and fraud and false narratives that we saw during the 2020 campaign and in the wake of the 2020 election results about voter fraud and insecure elections, which were roundly dismissed by the 60+ courts that heard the post-election lawsuits by President Trump's own Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice. But this belief that the 2020 elections were inherently or fraudulent, I should have said flawed, and somehow illegitimate, has really permeated the Republican base and Republican legislators who have made this sort of the centerpiece of their legislative strategy during this year. The other major focus of a lot of the election legislation that we've seen across the country has been a real emphasis on removing authority for election administration and rulemaking from election officials, both at the county and the statewide level, and placing that power in the hands of legislators. So election officials and county boards of election or election supervisors, many of them are elected directly by their constituents. Many county election boards are either non or bipartisan. But all election officials, in all of the states are charged with administering elections in a nonpartisan manner. And the state legislatures that are trying to exert more control over the election process are really doing so with often nakedly transparent partisan aims. In a state like Arizona, for example, the Arizona Senate is trying to conduct its own audit of Maricopa County's 2020 election, which was already audited, and doing so in a way that kind of cuts out the Republican majority county commission and the Secretary of State of Arizona. Similarly, the recent Georgia law that was passed gives the legislature greater authority to, remove or otherwise, interfere with county election administration without really clear standards for, what is misadministration, what justifies the state's sort of intercession in the county election administration. And so the potential for abuse for partisan aim is really, I think, a concern with what was passed in Georgia. And the reason that we're seeing this kind of concentration of electoral administrative power in the hands of state legislatures, I think has a lot to do with partisan gerrymandering. These legislators in most states draw their own legislative lines, and so are able to draw legislative districts in a way that protects incumbents and protects their own partisan majorities. The Supreme Court heard a partisan gerrymandering case that, full disclosure, CLC litigated, called Rucho versus Common Cause, that was decided in 2019. And the court, in a narrow 5-4 decision, much like the Shelby County decision, held that federal courts have no role in adjudicating partisan gerrymandering claims. And so it is really kind of up to state legislatures. They are permitted to draw lines in a way that will benefit the majority party. And so they are more insulated from electoral consequences than, say, a Secretary of State who is elected on a statewide basis. So they can, make these election law changes without having to worry about political blowback when they enact laws that are unpopular, sometimes even among members of their own party. And so I know that I'm getting more questions.
Yeah, we got some more questions. I mean, if you're kind of done with your, if you're done with your kind of overview points in the next couple of minutes, then we'll have a block of time for Q&A if you're able to.
Yeah, I just have one or two more big picture points that I want to make. So I think that it's important. I know that all of you are focused on your particular states and your particular state houses. But I think it is really important to contextualize a lot of this legislative activity against the backdrop of what is happening nationally. I'm sure that many of you have seen the New York Times reported last week that this kind of flood of election legislation is really part of a coordinated nationwide effort being undertaken by the RNC and with input and help from groups like the Heritage Foundation and ALEC and other big actors in the conservative legal and political spaces. So state level legislators are not coming up with these things on their own. It's part of a nationwide partisan effort to restrict access to the ballot for partisan gain. And the RNC's work on this is being led by this election integrity committee that is made up largely of party officials and members who were involved with the unsuccessful attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 election, who organized Stop the Steal rallies. And I don't think that you can really separate the conspiratorial nature of the post-November landscape leading up to the January 6th insurrection from this renewed push to restrict access to the ballot, because it's all designed to feed it to fulfill this narrative that the 2020 election was stolen and therefore voting has to be made more difficult to prevent that from happening again, when in fact many of these restrictive laws don't have any factual basis and are just designed to appease these conspiracy theories or to secure a partisan advantage at the expense of democratic principles. And so, election law and policy and these debates that are being had, I know that it can be easy sometimes to look at this as a left versus right or Republicans versus Democrats narrative because, these laws will have an impact on the outcomes of elections. But I would urge you, when you're talking about how a proposed law or policy might, change things, to really focus on what the impact will be on voters, because they're the ones who are going to feel the brunt of these laws and policies in a much more direct way than, who gets elected or, how campaigns are going to position themselves around what campaign strategy will be. Because, these policies are not just going to affect Democratic voters. It's going to affect voters of all political affiliations, rural voters, older voters, younger voters, voters of color. And it has real, even if it has short-term gain for, say, a particular candidate, I think that once we reduce election policy to what is going to help my team win next time, that has real lasting long-term damage on the health of our democracy as a whole. And when you have a party that is seeking to win elections by restricting the size of the electorate rather than by trying to appeal to more voters, at the expense of democracy, I think that that's a really dangerous trend and something that needs to be at the forefront of all of these conversations about voting rights and about this election legislation. And so, yeah, so when you're looking at these things, I would just urge you to consider the historical context and the national context and how what's happening in your state is reflective of this broader anti-democratic trend, little d democratic, not the party, the system. And when legislators give justifications for these bills, really probe that and consider whether those justifications are pretextual. I saw a lot of legislators in the last couple of weeks talking about how the bills that they're proposing are, to make things easier for disabled voters. When, the disability rights activists and the disabled voters that I work with are, up in arms about these bills because they haven't been consulted. And, the things that they are really concerned about from an access standpoint are not being addressed by this legislation. So that is, I think, everything that I had prepared to ramble on about. I know that it's a lot, but happy to take questions.
So we have a handful of questions, either hands raised or in chat. And we'll get through Jill, Sam, Stephen Caruso, Stephen Fowler, and Stella, and we'll start with Jill.
Hi, Jonathan. I'm Jill. I'm a producer and reporter for the Texas Standard statewide public radio program in Austin, Texas. We have measures here in the state that propose to expand rights for poll watchers, and I'm wondering if you could go into detail about like what poll watchers can and cannot do and where that line could be crossed by some of these proposals?
Sure. So, exactly what poll watchers can do and the particular regulations around them are, like everything else in election administration, going to vary state to state. But with respect to Texas in particular, I think that the bill that has been proposed and I think was passed by the Senate in Texas really gives poll watchers who are partisan actors selected by the parties really broad latitude to, not just to observe, but potentially to interfere with the process of election administration in ways that are really concerning. Because that particular bill would allow partisan poll watchers to do things like, for example, take photographs of voters who are getting assistance, say language accents assistance, if they think that the voter shouldn't be doing that. And when you have in a place like Texas, a lot of Latino voters who may have Spanish as their primary language, who are using assistance as they are legally entitled to do, that seems like a very easy slippery slope to voter intimidation, and to racial profiling, and to have partisan poll watchers harassing voters, or even after the voting process has concluded, harassing election officials and poll workers who are volunteers or county employees who are counting and processing ballots. We saw a lot of that in the days following the 2020 general election, where poll watchers were observing ballot processing and counting in places like Arizona and Pennsylvania, which they had to do from a certain distance. And that's meant to preserve, number one, like the privacy of people's ballots, but number two, like the safety and integrity of the work that the poll workers are doing. And so eliminating limitations on what poll watchers rather can do, I think opens the door to a lot of potential harassment or intimidation by partisan actors who could abuse that authority to interfere with the electoral process.
Okay. So we got a question in the chat from Sam Metz, who's with the AP in Carson City, Nevada. Can you talk about how to personally weigh arguments about voter ID bills and if possible, lay out the different kinds of them?
Sure. So, voter ID is a pretty popular policy and is pretty common. The issues surrounding voter ID and where some of the opposition to voter ID laws and policies come from is the fact that states often tailor their voter ID laws and policies in a way that benefits the types of voters that are more likely to align with one particular party over another. For example, in some states, you can use a gun license as a voter ID, but not a student ID. And that's because, I guess, of a perception that gun owners are more likely to vote Republican and college students are more likely to vote Democrat. In other states, the requirements for what information has to be present on an ID are very, very strict, so much so that it can be impossible for certain voters to meet those requirements. And so if you're requiring everyone to show an ID to vote, you need to also make sure that an ID is accessible to every voter. And in many states, in many cases, the way that ID requirements are structured makes that impossible. So for example, we litigated a case in 2018 in North Dakota because they had a very strict voter ID law that required a voter's photo ID to show their residential street address on it. But many Native American voters living in Indian country, in particular in rural parts of North Dakota, didn't have residential street addresses. So their North Dakota driver's license or their tribal ID, just could not meet the requirements of the state law for them to be able to vote. You had multiple state agencies in North Dakota, like the fire response system, and the Secretary of State's office and different agencies in North Dakota were assigning different conflicting street addresses to the same property. So when a voter ID law is structured in a way that, based on the types of ID that are permitted for use in voting, discriminates against certain populations, or makes it impossible for some voters to get the necessary ID, that's when it poses a real problem. And so opponents of voter ID tend to focus on the burdens that a strict voter ID requirement places on certain segments of the population, and the lack of a reasonable impediment exception. So some states that have strict voter ID laws have, have an alternative option. So if a voter cannot obtain the necessary ID because they don't have a birth certificate or they don't have a street address or whatever, they can sign an affidavit under penalty of perjury saying, I am a registered voter, I live in this state, I am eligible, I can't obtain an ID. Other states have tried to provide free IDs to voters, but I don't think that most advocates would say, we need to get rid of voter ID entirely. We just need to make sure that voter ID doesn't create an insurmountable barrier for some voters, especially poor voters, rural voters, and voters of color who often disproportionately lack the kinds of IDs that are mandated by the state.
Okay, so next question, Stephen Caruso.
Hi, I'm Stephen with the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Just sort of a quick question. There are these viral like tweets that go around in conservative circles, and also like I hear it when talking to lawmakers backing voter ID that like, oh, well, you need X. They'll rattle off all these things that say you need ID for, like, but you don't have voter ID. Have you ever like how much truth is there to these arguments? Like how many of these things that people are claiming, like in theory, yeah, like maybe it says somewhere that you might need an ID for this, but like I've just, has anyone like, have you fact checked that before? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that a lot of the comparisons that are made were like, you need photo ID for XYZ thing and not for voting are untrue along two axes. Number one, I think oftentimes the people making those claims know that photo ID is not actually required for the thing they say it's required for. Or they are in a jurisdiction where photo ID is required for voting. But I think the more important rejoinder to arguments like that is that many of the things that people claim voter or photo ID is required for are not things that you have a constitutional right to do. You have a constitutionally protected right to vote, and so you don't have a constitutionally protected right to, I don't know, whatever the thing is. It's often not the case, and so because the right to vote is paramount, the Supreme Court has said on multiple occasions that the right to vote is the most fundamental of rights because it is preservative of all of our other rights. Something like a photo ID requirement for voting needs to be subject to harsher scrutiny than a photo ID requirement for something else that is less important because of how fundamental voting is to our system of government. And so, it's not that photo ID is, presumptively always bad under all circumstances and shouldn't, and all that. It's that, we need to look very carefully at photo ID requirements to make sure that they are not creating barriers to voting, so much so that it makes it impossible or difficult for people to vote, which I think in many cases I would argue that it does.
Okay, so I have a question from Stella, who's with the Tennessean in Nashville. Tennessee has more obstacles for voting rights restoration than other states. It requires people to be up to date on child support, for example, to restore their voting rights. Bills expanding that are likely to die this year since the GOP has been resistant to the idea. Could you speak to the impact of this on disenfranchising voters?
Yes, Tennessee is, I think some people are surprised to learn, I think maybe the most restrictive state when it comes to voting. Tennessee is one of the handful of remaining states where you still need a statutorily prescribed excuse to vote absentee. They have the most convoluted and confusing felony disenfranchisement system in the country. where whether and when you get your rights restored after a felony conviction depends on a whole number of factors, including the year in which you were convicted. And so our Restore Your Vote program, which focuses on felony disenfranchisement issues at CLC, has done a lot of Tennessee specific work. And so, you know, something like Tennessee's bananas requirement that a voter be current on their child support payments in order to have their voting rights restored after a felony conviction, in addition to paying all the other legal financial obligations that are associated with the conviction, is just an often insurmountable barrier for voters or for Tennesseans trying to regain their rights to vote, and something that has nothing to do with voting. You know, we at CLC, we were part of the coalition of organizations that challenged the Florida law passed after Amendment 4 that imposed strict financial obligations, or didn't impose them, but required voters with felony convictions in Florida to pay all of their felony-related financial obligations, many of which were impossible to determine, before having their voting rights restored. And you know, we had a number of expert witnesses, academics who looked at the data, looked at the number of voters affected by this and the types of funds that were required. And you know, it numbers in the hundreds of thousands in Florida alone of people who otherwise would be able to restore their voting rights, but can't afford to. And saying the phrase, you know, somebody can't afford to be able to vote in 2021 is deeply upsetting. But it's not a problem that is unique to Florida. Tennessee is another, you know, particularly egregious example, but many states have similar such requirements of paying financial costs to have voting rights restored for people with felony convictions. And this is actually a great time to highlight something that I didn't mention, which is for those of you who have criminal justice reform or criminal law proposals on your beats as well, I think it's always important to think about how criminal law intersects with the election system. Anytime, in most states, anytime something is proposed that would create a new felony or would bump something up from a misdemeanor to a felony, oftentimes that will carry the collateral consequence of disenfranchising someone for the term of their incarceration or the term of their probation and parole, or in a few states indefinitely. And so when you're talking about criminalization, especially in states like Florida that is considering a pretty strict anti-protesting bill that would impose a lot of criminal penalties for certain types of protests, you know, think about the ways that, you know, it's the same government, it's the same legislature that is deciding what to criminalize and also deciding whether people who it has deemed felons can regain their rights to vote and when. And so all of these issues are super interconnected.
Okay, well, it's 12:50. I have one question. Let's see if we can get to this pretty quickly. It's from Stephen Fowler at Georgia Public Broadcasting. What types of arguments have been persuasive in convincing courts of a Section 2 challenge? In Georgia, we have a long history of suppressive laws that more blatantly target Black voters than our new 98-page law being challenged right now.
Yeah, Section 2 cases are, I think, very difficult for voting rights plaintiffs to bring because they tend to be very resource intensive. The Section 2 test, as articulated by a number of circuit courts and currently being considered by the Supreme Court in a case out of Arizona, requires challengers to show not only that a law has a racially discriminatory impact, so that, you know, that can involve statistical data, testimony from voters and experts, showing that minority voters will be more harshly affected, will have a greater burden on their ability to vote because of a law. You also have to link that that law to a number of factors. They're often called the Senate factors or the Jingles factors that are used to show a history of racial discrimination in voting and in society generally in that jurisdiction. So that can be anything from statements from legislators during the debates over the bill to, you know, whether the legislators knew about the disparate impact and proceeded to pass the bill anyway, to things like whether housing discrimination or economic discrimination or disparities adversely contribute to a minority group's ability to comply with a certain voting requirement. So one of the major Section 2 cases in recent history came out of Texas on Texas's voter ID law. And so some of the evidence that was considered by the courts in that case was the fact that Black and Latino voters in Texas were much less likely to have a driver's license or to be able to afford the fees and the costs associated with obtaining the necessary ID because of historical and social discriminatory factors. So it's a really resource-intensive litigation process. It requires a lot of expert witnesses, historical experts, economic experts, demographic experts, and the evidentiary records in these cases are often massive, and they can take years to resolve. So it is, it's a remedial tool. It's not a prophylactic measure. You can't bring a Section 2 case until a discriminatory law has been enacted. And so that's the big contrast between that process and the pre-clearance process that happens beforehand. As far as what specific evidence would have to be brought in a Section 2 case, it really is so context specific. It depends on what group is challenging it, who is allegedly being discriminated against, and in what way. So something like a reduction. I know that this wasn't in the final Georgia bill, but say a law that eliminated Sunday early voting, you would have had, statistical data showing that Black voters were more likely to vote on Sundays during the early voting period, and sociological or historical experts to talk about souls to the polls and Black church traditions and things like that. So it is really, really context specific and very, very resource intensive, which is why the Justice Department is often the primary player in Section 2 cases, although that hasn't been the case recently.
Okay, and with that, we need to draw this to a close. Jonathan, you've had some great detail and great history and great context. So I want to thank you very much for coming. Fellows, reach out to the Campaign Legal Center and Jonathan for more state-specific questions that you might have. So we wanted to talk about campaign finance. Pete Quist is the research director for at followthemoney.org. He's recently focused on the best practices for disclosure of money in state politics. Before that, he spent 2 years at Project Vote Smart, where he tracked the progress of congressional and state legislation, summarized key bills in plain language, and compiled voting records. So I've asked Pete to come and give an overview of the resources that they have, and not just the the calculation of how much money is going to politicians or candidates, but what the connection is between money going in and legislation being proposed. So Pete is going to give us an overview of the different ways that you can use the data they have and show you how to do it, and then we will draw it out. So Pete, welcome, and turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I'll go ahead and just share my screen here and go through what I'd like to talk about today. So this is our homepage at followthemoney.org. And here at the National Institute on Money and Politics, we've been collecting campaign finance data at the state level for about 20 years. And this includes contributions to every candidate running for state government office, legislative candidates and gubernatorial candidates and candidates for cabinet level positions in the states that elect those, and judicial candidates as well. And I'll get into some more detail on that in a moment. But this is the heart of what we do. We also do some additional data on independent expenditures and lobbying information. And we're doing this everything that I'm about to show you is free for journalists to use. We spend a lot of time in the back end in spreadsheets, and you'll hear me say this quite a bit during this presentation. It is really heartening for us to work with folks that are getting good use out of this data. It's why we do what we do. So some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is just kind of background on regulation and tying it into what the data looks like, and then moving into how we try to package that data in a way that you can tie it to governance. There's a lot to cover here. My intention with a presentation like this is not so that you will walk away knowing how to do everything that I'm about to show you, but just so that you know what's kind of available, and then give us a call. And our phone number is on the bottom of every page on our website. And I actually answer the phone, so please reach out, and that's what we're here for. So as I mentioned, the 3 avenues of money that we cover are campaign contributions, independent expenditures, and lobbying data. And this is important, as you guys know, to try to tie accountability to governance. It's not just gotcha stories, though, although that is certainly one of the values here. If you see something that's somebody's making large donations to a candidate and seems to be getting preferable policy choices, that's absolutely a story that needs to be written. But some of the data can be used for other stories, such as just measuring the overall health of an election, of campaign finance in a state. Most recently, there have been some analyses using our data to look at the effects of small donor public funding matching programs in New York and what that will look like and that sort of thing. So, and those findings have found that candidates tend to raise money in different patterns. They actually go out and solicit money from different donors, depending on sort of the parameters of public financing programs, and using some case studies to kind of measure that. So other kinds of stories as well. And we're happy to help with any of that stuff. As we collect this data, we're going actually to each state agency and getting the data. So sometimes this data is available through an electronic download from a state. Sometimes it's available through scanned images of handwritten paper reports. There is one state yet where we get some campaign finance reports sent to us in the mail, and we get it all. We make a list of every report that might have to be filed for an election, and we gather that and key it in if we have to, and then go through a robust process to make sure that what we've keyed in is accurate, with a separate check going through that. Our database is used extensively for academic purposes, so we need to maintain those standards as well. So, before I get into our data too much, I also want to make sure that people are aware of other organizations that may be helpful for them as they're doing reporting. I understand you guys have the Campaign Legal Center on. That's one of the key ones to be aware of. But on the menu in the upper left of our homepage here, if you click on resources and organizations, you can get a list of a lot of valuable organizations. I'll mention a couple here. The Campaign Legal Center obviously is one. The Campaign Finance Institute is actually a division of our organization, and I'll mention them in more detail in a moment. Most of you will be aware of the Center for Responsive Politics, which has extensive campaign finance data at the federal level going back about 30 years. The Center for Political Accountability is working on getting voluntary campaign finance disclosure from publicly traded companies, and particularly where they're engaged in independent spending activity that may not be reported at the state level. And Good Jobs First has incredible databases that they're putting together, looking at things like violations and fines that companies are receiving for things like environmental violations in states, and tax subsidies that companies may be receiving, state contracts and that sort of thing. And they actually tie their data, they tie our data into their data, so you can start doing that accountability piece. And Little Sis is the last one I'll mention here. They are largely crowdsourcing their work, but I'm trying to draw lines between, trying to draw relationships. So if you find somebody that is coming up in a story and want to see if they have relationships with other people that might be showing up in your data sets or just in your stories in general, Little Sis is a great resource to get actual relationship maps kind of a thing. So I mentioned that the Campaign Finance Institute is a division of our organization, and I wanted to highlight one of the tools that we have through that website, which is at cfinst.org. Hoping to migrate this over to the Follow the Money website soon, but it's this database of state laws. One thing to keep in mind as you're writing stories is that every state has its own regulations about campaign finance disclosure, contribution limits, and essentially every piece of campaign finance. This tool is a great resource for putting practices in your state into context. So for example, right now we're looking at contribution limits from individuals to candidates for the state house or assembly. And this map is showing you what the contribution limits are in these kinds of brackets here to the right. And if I mouse over the $1,000 or less, you can see which states have the lowest contribution limits for individuals giving to candidates for the lower chamber, and so forth. And if you mouse over a state, you can actually get what that limit is. This is all normalized over a 2-year period as well. Some states have limits that are applicable to different timeframes. Washington State has limits that are applicable to the number of voters in your district. So every legislative candidate is subject to a slightly different contribution limit. This normalizes everything to make it comparable across states. So as you're looking at, if you've got major donors showing up in your state, and you're interested in just like what are neighboring states doing in terms of capping that or disclosing that, there's a lot of information here, and you can download most of it as well. And you can alter this to look at contributions from other sources or to other kinds of candidates. This in particular, I think, is really interesting and good to be aware of. This is looking at whether corporations can make contributions from their treasuries to candidates for State House. At the federal level, when you see quote unquote corporate money, what you're seeing is contributions from PACs to candidates for the US House or US Senate or President. And those PACs are funded by individuals associated with that company, usually executives and board members. This map is showing you where the corporations don't have to do that. They can just give directly to the candidates themselves. And similarly for the labor unions. And it's about half the states for those corporations and unions. And there's a lot of other things in here. Our employment information required to be reported for donors and that sort of thing. This is all just a wealth of information to put your state into context with other states. All right, let's talk about data. This is my favorite stuff. I love data. I'm a data head. I like to talk about this a lot. And if I scroll down here, we can go over, I mentioned a little bit some of the data that we collect, but on our homepage at followthemoney.org, this is a breakdown of the data sets that we have. So you can see, as I mentioned, we have contributions to state elections going back to 2000, the 2000 election cycle. We also began getting, we expanded that into the intermediate appellate courts in the mid-2000s and have been gathering that ever since. Candidates for judicial office are tending to raise a little bit more money than they used to in the states where that kind of office is elected. And some of that is in response actually to the Citizens United decision that allowed increased outside spending funding sources where particularly candidates for retention have traditionally not raised money. This is a yes or no on keeping them in office. But in the last few years, they've started to raise money in a lot of states because of those independent expenditure campaigns coming in. Contributions to political parties and to ballot measure committees as well in all 50 states, and or to the extent that there are any ballot measures in your state. And so we can run searches across all of this, and I'll demonstrate that soon. And then we've been getting independent expenditures in some states since 2006. The number of states in which we get independent expenditures is 29. There are a few states where you don't have to report any independent expenditures when you make them. And there are many states where you don't have to report certain kinds of independent expenditures when you make them. And I'll get into that a little bit more a little later. We've also expanded to contributions to federal campaigns since 2010. I'll be focusing on state campaigns for this demonstration though. And then we have lists of registered lobbyists and their clients in every state since 2006. So we can see who's registered to lobby and who they're employing to do that lobbying for them. And we have the money spent on lobbying in 20 states. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is in 50 states a little later as well. Then we have some select local jurisdictions, which I will be kind of glossing over today. But they are New York City, Washington, DC, and Chicago. So what I'm going to do is run a couple of searches here, kind of demonstrate how the data looks, how to kind of get around in it, what value we add to it with the work that we do to try to make this more usable than just raw campaign finance data from the states for you guys. And once I've done that and shown a couple of uses of it, I will stop for a minute and ask for some questions. And then I'll get into a little bit more of the independent spending and lobbying background, and then into a couple of tools after that that try to tie the campaign finance information to governance. So as we get this data, we are doing a couple of things with it. One of them is that as we're collecting these campaign contributions, we are classifying the contributors by economic interest. So if we go to the menu in our data and about our data, you can get a breakdown of what these interests sort of look like. And this has some background about where they come from. But these are very broad classifications here. So you can look at, for example, the health industry. And these are all things that we'll be able to search by too, which I'll show in a minute. But within health, we do subclassifications. So you can look at things like pharmaceutical and health products specifically, or get even more specific than that and look at wholesale pharmaceutical companies. And what this means is that on the interface that I'm about to show you, we could do a search for contributions from everything within health, which would include hospitals and that sort of thing, or we could get really specific or anywhere in between. So as you're writing issue stories and thinking about whether or not there might be a campaign finance angle on what a state is considering, this is a really useful tool to be able to look at if certain industries are involved in the story, and we can look at those donors. All right, so the main entry point that I'm going to show here is our Ask Anything search, and it's up in the upper right. There are a couple of places you can get to this, but it's basically an advanced search engine, and it allows you to hopefully ask about anything that you can come up with. As the years have gone by and we have received questions where our public-facing interface was not able to provide an answer, we have added on to it. It is our ethos that if you can't answer a question with the interface we're providing, then we need to make it better. This is supposed to be trying to make the data as transparent as possible. But there is a lot, there are a lot of options here as a result. So again, as I go through this, it won't be an expectation on my end anyway that people memorize everything, but just to know what's kind of available. And then to reach out and contact me. So here we get a little pop-up. It says currently looking at contribution data. And then we have a couple of buttons here that are contributions from and contributions to. And these are the main buttons that we're going to use to build a query here. And I'm going to go over some of the options, then I'll run a basic search. So under contributions from, we can ask for contributions from all kinds of sources. So if you want to look at contributions from a specific contributor, or even a list of a few contributors, you can do that here. And it's just searching for contributions by the name of a contributor. Or if you want to do multiple, you can click on the select multiple and you can start typing in names. You'll get some results down here and you can select the ones that you like, and they end up in this currently selected box. You just keep typing more names. You can basically build a list as long as you want. If you have a really long list, reach out to us because we can offer services that are better than typing in a bunch of names. If you have a file, we can process that for you and return data for you. We do contributions from subsidiaries and employees of organizations, the industries. So this is the same list that we were just looking at. So we can do contributions from health. And if we, anytime you see these little black arrows, it means that there are more options. And so we can open that up. You can see everything is selected below health because I've selected health. And you see those same subclassifications here, and I can get really specific with them. We can also do contributions from certain locations. So if you're interested in looking at contributions from maybe the town that a legislator represents, or some set of towns that the legislator represents, you can see where those contributions are coming from, or maybe from outside of that town. So what we oftentimes see in many states is that the first time somebody's elected, they are receiving a lot of individual contributions from the district that they are trying to represent. And then after that, we will see a lot of non-individual contributions, PACs and the like, from the capital. The types of contributors allows you to look for contributors that are individuals versus non-individuals. So political action committees, corporations, unions, and allow you to sort of get a look at how grassroots somebody's campaign may be in terms of where they're getting their money from. And then the types of records is looking for contributions by date and dollar amount ranges. So pretty much anything that we have in the database is a field that you can search by in this interface. And then in contributions to, we can look at contributions to candidates, to sitting office holders, which I'll touch on, to ballot measure committees and to political party committees. To some extent, you can look at contributions to independent spenders. If you're writing a story about independent expenditures, reach out to us right away and we'll help you sort of understand what the parameters are there. And then this filer is just kind of a catch-all. Or you can look at contributions to states and years in general. But within these, you can even get very specific. So if I click on candidates, we can look at contributions to a specific candidates that are running against each other in a given race, candidates for types of offices, such as gubernatorial, cabinet level positions, legislative and judicial offices. All those offices that we track are searchable. You can look at contributions to candidates that are winners or losers, or by political party or incumbency, pretty much anything that you'd like to look at that's available through campaign finance and election data. Again, we're also trying to tie election data into campaign finance data so that you can get these breakdowns that aren't necessarily available from the state's campaign finance agency, which may not have information about incumbency or win-loss status. The office holders options are very similar to the candidate options, although one notable exception is that you can look at office holders by legislative committee. So you can do searches for contributions to legislative committee members. And that is something that I will get into here in a little bit. You can also look at contributions to members of the legislature who are in leadership positions. We track, we document who is in the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the majority and minority leaders in each chamber. And then I'll kind of gloss over these last two, but with ballot measures, we can look at contributions to ballot measure committees that are working on a specific ballot measure or by subject. So if you want to look at contributions to committees that are working on ballot measures across the country that are working on some energy issues or housing issues or something like that, you can absolutely do that here. And political party committees by Republican and Democratic Party committee, state and year and that sort of thing. I'm going to run just kind of a simple search here just to demonstrate how this works. So what we'll do is contributions to a few states in the last couple of years. And so I'm going to do, we're going to try to build a sentence using these buttons. So I'm going to do contributions to certain states. So we'll do contributions to campaigns in certain states. So it's contributions to, and then specific state. So we've got these black arrows here. If I click on this one, then we'll expand the list of states. And we're going to just grab Arkansas, Alaska, and Arizona right now. And then I click OK. You can select as many as you'd like. I'm selecting these ones because they're a little bit, they're not overly large, and there is some interesting information in the campaign finance there. And I want this to load quickly. So these states are a good kind of demonstration. And then we'll do contributions to elections in the last couple of years. You can see that we've got years prior to 2000. 2000 is when our data really began. We backfilled some data prior to that, but it is not as consistently done. If you have questions about going back more than 20 years in campaign finance data, which you might, just reach out to us and we can kind of help you out with what that would mean. So you can see I'm building a sentence that says, show me contributions to candidates and committees and elections in these 3 states in these 2 years. And then the last thing that I'm going to do, because we have US House and US Senate races, that would include elections in these 3 states would include those. I'm going to limit this, it says within federal, state, and local data here. Just going to limit this to state data. Within state data. And I'll click go. So I am now looking at all the contributions to campaigns, candidates, party committees, ballot measure committees, to some extent, independent spending committees in these 3 states over these two election years. And you can see right off, I get a results page with 168,000 contributions, totaling $117 million here. This is a typical results page on a query like this. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. I'll come back in so you guys can see it a little bit better. But what we're looking at is a table underneath here. It's not obvious yet, but it has the same number of records and the dollar amount. And then the way that this interface will work for you is very similar to pivot tables in Excel. You can group this data in lots of different ways. So for example, if we want to know how much of this $117 million was raised by campaigns in each of these 3 states, we can click on this election jurisdiction box, and the table will aggregate that data by state for us. The number of records refers to the number of transactions. So the vast majority of transactions are in Arizona, and Arizona has about double the money of the next highest state in this list. we can add things like the sector. So this is this broad sector, general industry, and specific business. Those three things reflect the very like the health, and then the pharmaceuticals and health products, and then the wholesale pharmaceutical companies. So basically those three tiers. And if we add that broad tier, then we get a list where each row represents a state and a sector. And in this case, we see that although Arizona was by far the biggest state in terms of fundraising, Alaska energy and natural resources money is by far the biggest source of contributions from a sector in a state within this data set. And if we'd like to dive into what that looks like, we can do that using this magnifying lens. Anytime you have a table on this interface, there will always be a magnifying lens on the left side that allows you to dive into the data that makes up that row. Before I do, I will mention that there is uncoded here. What this reflects are contributions that we haven't categorized yet. Our system does a pretty good job about identifying contributors that it has seen before, that we've classified with their economic interest, using some tables in the background that I'll show you in a minute, that have name and address variations essentially that it recognizes. But to the extent that it doesn't identify a contributor and their economic interest, we as the staff will go through, there are just a couple of us that go through the data for the entire country and try to do that so that the system can learn from what we do. We start with the largest donors and work our way down as we do that. So you'll see that with this uncoded dollar amount, although it's relatively large, the number of records is relatively large too. The average contribution, if you were to divide this, is relatively small. So I'm clicking on the magnifying lens next to the energy and natural resources for Alaska, and you'll see that I've opened up a new browser tab. And this is showing me energy and natural resources contributions to Alaska. And so it's that easy. Got 758 contributions for that $19 million there. And then we can see who those contributors are, for example, by clicking on this contributor box. The main story here, though, for this data set is who the recipient is. What we've got with these checkboxes are just like we saw with the search interface: candidate, ballot measure committee, party committee, independent spender, and this filer is kind of a catch-all. This happens to be a ballot measure committee. If we click on it, then we can find out what this committee was doing. So if you click on the name of any person or group in our database, you will go to a page that is all of the information that we know about them. We're no longer associated just with that query anymore. This is One Alaska, vote no on one. This is going to tell you everything that we know about this organization, including, as a ballot measure committee, which measures it has supported or opposed. And in this case, it opposed a tax increase on the North Slope in Alaska. So by closing those prior tabs, I'm back at my original search. Every time you click on a name or a magnifying lens, it will open up a new browser tab for you so that you can maintain your prior search and work with that. And I'm removing the economic interest and just grouping by contributor here. So now I'm grouped by contributor and state. And we can see a list of the top donors in each state. I mentioned there's a lot of functionality here, as you can see. You can group this data by the party affiliation of candidates and so on. Pretty much any field, again, that we have is something that you can group this data by. So you can see how much contributions have come from an industry to winning Democratic candidates for state Senate across the years that you've chosen in the states that you've chosen, for example. But one of the other things that I mentioned was that we do a lot of standardization to try to group these contributions together for you. So for example, in this Hillcorp Energy, which is given $4 million here in Alaska, the number of records there is 5. That means that there are 5 transactions associated with that $4 million. Still pretty sizable transactions. If we click on Hillcorp Energy, we'll get a table of all the ways that we've standardized this. So as I mentioned, we're looking at name and address variations that we recognize as Hillcorp Energy. And this is all stuff that our system is automatically doing for you in the back end. So that if you're looking for contributions from Hillcorp Energy, regardless of what state you're looking in, regardless of what state they're making campaign contributions in, this information as it comes into our system will automatically standardize for you. So you don't have to look for all those different name variations that you will see in raw state campaign finance data. You're seeing this right now because I'm logged in as a member of the staff. You won't actually see this list publicly, but I want to show you what it kind of looks like. We also do that for individuals. So here you can get a list of all the name and address variations that we're recognizing as this individual, regardless of what they're doing in our system, making campaign contributions, running for office, and et cetera. Everything that I do on this interface is affecting the URL. So if you build a table that you like, you can embed that in a story using this URL. You can also export the data using this data export option, which is going to drop me down just to the bottom of the page, where there are, this is the table above, where there are export options in flat files or as API. And so you can stream this data to your own website. I want to highlight just a couple of, I'll just do one API example here to sort of show you what that might look like. So with the R data and APIs, this is where you get the documentation for APIs. And I really like to point these out because you can do essentially anything you want with this. It doesn't have to be a flat table. It can be. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution has a page where they just have a profile page for every legislator in Georgia. And they have all kinds of information from different sources that's streaming to their website for the profile page for each legislator. And one of those things is a table of their top 100 donors, and that's streaming from our website. This WRAL one is a little different. If we go to this example, this is a story announcing their new tool, where you can stream that data, top donors, to people. It's like they're mentioning sitting legislators here in their story. And if you mouse over the name, the top 5 donors are coming up, and that's streaming just from our website. So the sky's the limit on what you can do with that information. I'll take some questions there before I talk a little bit more. I'll talk very briefly about independent expenditures and lobbying. I'm not going to give an in-depth demo on it. I will just mention that the interfaces are very similar to what they were for the campaign contributions that we just looked at. But then I'd like to get into some of those tools about tying the data into governance.
Okay, so we'll have a question from Stephen Caruso. Then I have 3 text questions from Samantha, Laura Bischoff, and Stefan. So Stephen Caruso.
Hi, I'm Stephen. I'm in Pennsylvania at the Capital Star. I just kind of have a question on like where the data is coming from. Like I get Department of States, but because I guess what I'm interested in is that sometimes I've like used Follow the Money and tried to look up like donations from one county to another, and I've seen things that like, and this would have been last election cycle. So if like the site has changed a little since then, that's might be it. But like it looked like there was like duplicative listings, so it was kind of hard for me to tell, like, wait, are these just the same, or, you know, is it repeating? And then like, you know, I've gone then to like state documents and been able to figure it out which were duplicative and which were the actual donations. But so I guess I'm just like interested in like, what's the process that gets data from the departments of states or, you know, like the governments into your, into Follow the Money?
Yeah, right. So every time I'll pull up a quick interface here. What I'm doing is running a query that you can do through the interface, but just typing it in. As I mentioned, the URL is reflecting everything that you do anyway. As we add candidates and committees to our system that we know we want campaign finance data for, we make a list of every report that they could conceivably have to file during the election cycle. So in this case, we're looking at contributions to state candidates and committees in Alaska 2020 elections. And there are 1,551 reports that could potentially be filed. As those report due dates go by, we go and collect those campaign finance reports as soon as we can. There is oftentimes a lag because we only have 6 people that are actually getting the data from the states. So we have to prioritize states, work with different formats and that sort of thing. But we get it as quickly as we can. And so we make sure that we're gathering every campaign finance report as it's filed. We do have a robust deduplication process that looks for possible duplicates and flags them for us to review. Sometimes what you'll see, if you do see anything questionable, please do reach out to us. There have been a few times during my time here where we have found an actual error, and it's always good to get that feedback. We will track that down for you and show you where the data came from for any specific thing that you're looking at. Sometimes though, what you'll see, particularly in states that have different contribution limits for or a duplicative contribution limit for primary and a general, where a candidate can raise X dollars for the primary and X dollars again for the general, is that you have people, depending on the rules, write 2 checks on the same day for the same amount, and that gets attributed to the primary and the general as well.
Okay, so I have a question from Laura Bischoff of the Dayton Daily News. Are you scraping the data from state databases automatically so it's the latest information?
Right, so we do scrape from many states. We use just download options where we can. We do have to piece together quite a bit of information. So in Nebraska, for example, we can download data from there, but they don't report the unitemized dollar amounts. So we have to actually look at like report totals and itemized totals and do the math to identify the unitemized dollars. Some states don't include other pieces like loans and loan repayments, returned contributions, certain other kinds of transactions within downloadable data sets. So we have a lot of experience working with each state's data. And so we know which pieces we can get through which formats. So we'll download where we can, go print reports to get the pieces that we need and key those in so that everything is complete. The data is as up to date as we can keep it, but there is that lag that I mentioned as well.
Okay. Steph, question from Stefan Johnson of New Amsterdam News. For pages that don't have reports released yet, is it because you're in the middle of working them or just don't have the info yet?
Yeah, so we are currently finishing up with the 2020 election data collection. We are about 97% complete with the number of, there are about 220,000 campaign finance reports at the state level that we're collecting for the 2020 elections, and we've got about 97% of them in. The stage that we're at right now with that is identifying why we don't have that other 3%. And oftentimes what that is that a candidate no longer was a candidate for some reason, deceased, disqualified, or something like that, or terminated their committee after losing a primary, and we're just making sure that we have that comprehensively done. But we're also at the same time moving into 2021 and just now beginning to collect those campaign finance reports for 2021. Where you don't see data yet, it's because either we haven't collected data yet, or we haven't collected data that matches your search parameters. So if you're doing a contribution for, or if you're doing a search for contributions from a specific donor or a specific industry, and we haven't identified contributions from that kind of a source within the data set that you're looking at, then the search will come up empty. Reach out to us though when you're seeing that. We're happy to look at that with you.
Okay, question from Samantha Modilano, who was from Politico, but Samantha has a new job. Congratulations, Samantha. I think just started today or something, right? But she asked this early on, so maybe you've covered this, but Pete, how local does the data breakdown get?
Yeah, so we can get down to transaction level data. So in this case, we're looking at 26,000 contributions totaling $33 million here. Record is this website's language for transaction. And so you can actually get down to the date and amount of each check. And so that's, in terms of local as far as granular, that's the answer there. You can get down to that level if you'd like to. In terms of local for level of governance, we are collecting contributions to state candidates, and that does include state legislative candidates, which are about as local as you can get for state government office typically. We do not get contributions to like city council and county supervisors and that sort of thing, with the exception of New York City, Washington, D.C. city elections, and Chicago city elections.
Okay, and another question from Laura from Dayton. Any effort to track and disclose political spending by 501c4 organizations? They're a huge factor in Ohio public corruption case. Disclosure is limited to IRS 990 forms and 8872 forms.
Yeah, so independent expenditures is just, it's a tough animal when you have nonprofit organizations getting involved. And in some states, it's a tough animal. Nonprofit organizations are difficult because they can make contributions to candidates. Oftentimes, the corporate regulations apply to nonprofit corporations like 501c4s. And so we saw that many states allow corporations to make contributions to candidates. So you can see some dark money contributions directly to candidates in some states. We do track the independent expenditures to the extent that we can. On this Ask Anything, this is actually a button. So if I click contributions data, you can see I can switch to independent spending and lobbying spending data. If I click the independent spending data, you can see just another interface that looks a lot like the contributions data, but the buttons are a little different. You can run queries like this to see those expenditures, including who's making that expenditure, the 501c4, and actually get that data in the states where we do have it. Trying to get the sources of funding for the 501c4s is just really hard. Some states do require that if you make an independent expenditure, you report the contributions that you receive, usually trying to limit that to the amount of money that you're spending for reasons related to legal regulation. So what they'll do is require you to disclose contributions that were earmarked for the purpose, or use a last in, first out accounting method where you're reporting your most recent donors backwards until you account for that money. But what groups will do at that point is just form a political action committee in your state, and then the 501c4 will give to the PAC, and then the PAC will make the expenditure and report the dark money group as its donor. And so it's still problematic. California has a law that they passed in 2014 that tries to address that issue, where if you make a contribution or engage in politics in that state, and you are a dark money group, you report just as I described with the last in, first out. But if you report another dark money group, or if the PAC reports a dark money group, then that dark money group is ostensibly subject to disclosure requirements of the same sort to account for the amount of money that they've funded this other dark money group with, or whatever, and back on down the line until you get to a real source. I think that law is currently under challenge, and so we'll kind of see what comes with it, and I'm not sure how strong enforcement really is right now. The answer, unfortunately, is just not very good. There's not a good way to get to that data.
Anna from the Miami Herald asked, what states require C4s report their donors?
California is the leading example there. There are some others where if the C4 itself makes an expenditure, then it has to do the kind of reporting that I just described, but then they'll just set up a PAC and give to that PAC, and then the PAC is the only thing subject to that disclosure because it made the expenditure.
All right, those are all the questions in the queue as of right now. It's 1:45, so if you're able to get to the next segment, or the governance segment, and then we'll have a few more minutes for questions after that. Sounds
great. So on our homepage here, there is a tool that I will draw your attention to called the My Legislature tool. Excuse me. So it's down under the map in our tools section. Lots of different stuff in here, including different ways to get to a couple of the data sets. This is the My Legislature tool. Unfortunately, I am still personally working on populating legislative committees for 2021. So I'm going to use 2020 as a demo here, but we can select any state that we'd like. I'm grabbing Wisconsin. And this takes you to the My Legislature page for Wisconsin. There are a couple of things on here that take about 10 seconds to load. So I've preloaded this page, and we'll take a look at what's available here. We start with the list of all of the sitting legislators in the state. The legislative leadership, so you can see who's in charge in each chamber. And then the top contributors to sitting legislators in Wisconsin. This is career. And then you can also break down recent contributions by political party affiliation. And then this is a list of other elected office holders in Wisconsin. Wisconsin elects their judicial offices, so there's a big slate there. But then you have your more traditional governor and secretary of state and so forth. But within this, the main power of this tool is if you're tracking a piece of legislation and you're interested in looking at the campaign finance angle for considering legislation. We have a bill feed for every piece of legislation introduced in every session in every state. And this comes from a for-profit corporation called Legiscan. We have a data sharing agreement with them where we get some of their bill information and sponsorship information in exchange for some of our campaign finance information. Within this tool, what I'm going to do is jump down to a specific bill here. I'm going to use Assembly Bill 237. And if I click on this bill, then it's going to give me some information, and this is all streaming from Legiscan through an API. So it's another example of how versatile APIs can be. The overview of the bill from the state, the list of sponsors of this piece of legislation. Some states only allow one sponsor per bill. Some states allow many. And then the top donors to the sponsors of the piece of legislation. And I guess I waited too long to get here. It is reloading it. But so these are those dozen or so sponsors that we have. These are the top donors to their campaigns over the years. We can also look at what has happened with the bill. So which committees it got referred to and so forth. In this case, this bill got referred to the Assembly Committee on Workforce Development. If this was in live action, then we could go to that committee. And so look at this committees tab. And this is the membership list that I was talking about that I'm working on for 2021. This is a membership list of every standing committee in every legislature in every state. So if we click on the Workforce Development Committee, we get a list of the committee members, including the chairmanships. Excuse me. And then we can look at contributions to members of this committee. And this is again career. So, and then there's an industry analysis tool that is trying to look at how members of this committee fare in their fundraising from different economic interests in comparison to members of the legislature as a whole, with the bars kind of representing what members of the committee are raising compared to members of the legislature in general. This one is looking a little wonky. It was looking better this morning. We're making some server changes, so I'm wondering if that's impacting that. And then about the data. And if we click on the about the data, this takes us to this button that actually, this is sort of buried, but allows you to look at contributions to members of that legislative committee on that Ask Anything interface. I took a moment earlier to point out that on the Ask Anything interface itself, you can do contributions to office holders on a legislative committee. That is another way to get here. So you can actually just do this and type in Wisconsin House and find the Workforce Development Committee and get to the same data set. And what we're looking at now are career contributions raised by members of this legislative committee. And we can group that by, for example, the office holder, in which office they're in, and include all of that information. We can add a breakdown of the contributor and all of the economic classification information. So now this table is going to show me how much money Patrick Snyder, for example, received from the Wisconsin Republican Assembly Campaign Committee, which we've classified as a party committee, 9 contributions for $183,000. And you can go down the list and start getting into some of those private communications, private donations, so like Clear Channel Communications, for example. And so this is our effort to try to allow you, as you're working on a campaign or a legislation story, to really start looking at where the money is coming from for the people that are sponsoring a piece of legislation or considering it in a committee. We can also do just on a new Ask Anything search. You can do contributions to office holders and type of office. And then within the state, we'll just grab the state Senate and state House. If you're working on a piece of legislation where it's perhaps up for a floor vote and you want to take a look at the contributions to all of the legislative members in your state, and then we'll do contributions to a specific state. And for this demo, I'll just grab Alaska. Now we're looking at contributions to sitting legislators in Alaska. And you can do the same breakdown. So you've got a list of where they're getting their money from for each individual in here. So this is all very raw data that is queried in a way to try to tie it into stories that are focused on governance. There is also a tool that we've launched relatively recently that is trying to package it into a more visual presentation. And if we go to our tools, we've got quite a few tools that I'm not going to be able to cover today, but this power mapping tool is one that has a couple of characteristics on it that are very interesting. And what I'm going to do here is just grab Wisconsin. And what we're seeing with this chart right now is a list of everybody involved in the legislative process. So the senators, the members of the assembly, governors, I'm going to switch this to 21, and the lieutenant governor. The y-axis here, the up and down axis is, actually switch that back, is trying to rank these people based on how much power they have over the legislative process. And so what it's doing is showing the governor at the top, who has signing or veto power. And then you'll see the Senate president is typically next, followed by the Speaker of the House, and then the rank and file based on things such as how many legislative committees they sit on, how many committees they chair, and that sort of thing, trying to map that power. We're going to grab a specific legislative committee. And in this case, I'm just going to grab the Energy Committee. And so now we're just mapping members of a specific State House committee in Wisconsin. The reason I want to bring this up is because if you're reporting on an issue, and advocates actually use this too, but if you're reporting on an issue or a piece of legislation, you can map out in this committee, for example, how likely members of the committee are to support or oppose the piece of legislation based on their campaign contributions. Obviously, there are a lot of other factors that come to play, but their campaign contributions is what we do. And so this is meant to add to that kind of an assessment. So for example, if you can plug in a bill. We'll just grab from the regular session, and you can plug in a bill. And if the sponsor of a bill is a member of this committee, then that sponsor will move into the right side of the x-axis here, which indicates that that person is likely to be more supportive of the bill because they sponsored it. But we can also do things like industry breakdowns. So if you're working on, here in Wisconsin, we're working on an energy industry bill, and perhaps the industry is unfavorable to it, then we can say that the energy industry is opposed to this piece of legislation. And this is just some gradient of support and opposition that you plug in. And perhaps the labor unions are very much in support. And of course, labor has been a big deal in Wisconsin in recent years. And what this is doing now is mapping out the members of this legislative committee based on the campaign contributions they've received from the energy industry and from the labor unions to try to map out what they might, how supportive or unsupportive they may be on this particular bill or general issue. Each one of these dots is an actual human, and you can click on that person to get information about their campaign finance, the money that is involved with this particular query that we've done with energy and labor. And this person has not received any labor money, but has only received a little bit of energy money as well. And so just slightly to the left on the map here. And then one of the things that is also worth keeping in mind on this is that we use donor contribution patterns to assign partisan alignment of campaign contributors. An AT&T, for example, will have a partisan alignment of essentially 0. They give to incumbents, and they don't care what party you are, which is a common approach of most for-profit interests. Individuals tend to give on a more partisan basis, and ideological groups as well. Unions tend to lean a little bit more Democratic. However, they will give to Republicans in states where they need to. But what we're doing here is each of these individuals on this committee is now being mapped out based on this being a potentially partisan issue, based on their party alignment, which is derived from whether they receive contributions from donors who are overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democratic. And so we're able to do different mapping like this. This kind of thing also, we geocode contributions. And so if you're working on stories about redistricting in the next couple of years, we may have some options to help you out with that kind of thing and what maps might look like. So that's a lot to kind of cram in for a few minutes on this, but I did want to highlight this tool as well. Any other questions?
Yeah, so we got a few more minutes. I am as somebody who puts together programs to see fellows say, whoa, that's awesome, and whoa, I can't wait to test this feature out. My day's done, I'm going to call it a day, call it a week. That's what I'd love to see. It's a great tool, and I'm glad we were able to introduce it to the fellows. But we have time for a couple more questions if anybody has. Let me see, no. One fellow who's using it for a story this weekend, but Lucille. So go for it, Lucille.
Hi, I'm really excited about this. I don't know how I didn't know about this before because it makes my job way easier. But I'm clicking around looking at like how much different candidates got in elections. And if I'm looking by industry, I can't figure out how to separate it out by year. Can you run through that one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we are on the Ask Anything search, if you are doing contributions to, this is a pop in here. If you're doing contributions to campaigns in a specific state, for example, so we're doing contributions, and I'll just grab Alabama, and I'm just going to look at state level, and I'm skipping over a lot of this, but again, don't struggle with these interfaces. Just give me a call, and our number's at the bottom of every page on our site. And it is what we're here for, and it's nice to get out of the spreadsheets. You can break it down by year by adding this election year box. And so if you're looking at contributions across time, this is the way to do that, and it will break it out with any other breakdowns that you have too. So if you've got it broken out by sector, then it will aggregate by sector and year.
Okay, I think I got to it in a roundabout way. Thank you.
You bet.
Lauren Gibbons, do you still have a question?
Oh yeah, I just had a question, and this is just more generally speaking. Pete, do you or anyone else on staff, in addition to answering some of the technical questions, do you get quoted by news organizations, or do you offer interviews to kind of provide context on whether a specific, like if I had a question about whether a specific donation was weird compared to what other states do, or that kind of thing? Is that something that you're open to?
All the time. Yep.
Okay.
So, and I'm typically the one to take those. So you'll get to talk to me again. But yes, we are happy to talk about what the data means in terms of like its context in campaign finance spheres. We will not get into ethical questions, so I won't be able to answer those, but certainly describing what's normal based on what normally happens and that sort of thing, talking about how regulations impact what data you might see and how elections work, all that kind of stuff.
All right, Sam.
If you do ask us a question that is outside of our purview, something that we can't comment on, as we maintain our nonpartisan status, we won't get into things that might look potentially partisan just as a comment. Then we may be able to find other organizations or things that are too legal for us to answer. I can answer some basic questions there, but we may be able to provide you with contact information for somebody else that will be a good resource too. That's another thing that we do. And the Campaign Legal Center actually is one of the ones that we refer to people to a lot.
Okay, and final question, Sam, did you still have a question?
Pete kind of answered it. I've quoted you before in stories and just wanted to ask about the parameters of what you guys can comment on. It's kind of been about some of the gotcha nuggets that you find in this data. And yeah, I just wanted to ask about the parameters of what you guys comment on. So you answered it. Thank you.
Feel free to call me up and ask me. If I can't answer it, I'll just tell you that I can't. Awesome. But I can at the very least kind of tell you, maybe not offhand, but after a few minutes of research, like whether what you're seeing is unusual.
In like broader context, yeah. Awesome, thank you.
Okay, and last question of the day and the fellowship to Anna.
Hi, Pete. I have a question regarding the nationwide context, I guess. We have been doing stories on dark money and the influence on one election, and we found that it was a C4 registered in Delaware, and so it was really hard to know. And then after the election, the name of the donor changed, and it was also a C4 in Delaware that led to a UPS store. Is that usually like how it works, like in terms of like how popular is Delaware for dark money groups? Just hide there.
Delaware is known for its opaqueness on certain kinds of corporate registrations. Right. I haven't looked extensively at the addresses of dark money groups, but the disclosure requirements for dark money groups are really as far as where they get their money from if they engage in politics in a state are really reliant on the state in which that political activity is happening. So if they make contributions to an election in South Dakota, for example, the disclosure requirements that they would have to report to the South Dakota Elections Agency or Campaign Finance Agency would be dictated by the South Dakota political disclosure laws.
Yeah.
The 501c4s are they're just hard in general. There aren't places that make that information really available wholesale anywhere. And the IRS ostensibly has traditionally received information from these organizations about who their contributors are so that they can validate their tax exempt status. But the IRS won't share that information. It doesn't see itself as a political disclosure agency. On the contrary, its mission is to keep data private because it's very much tax information. So what we're really relying on here is the idea that political agencies will and legislatures will push for political disclosure laws.
Has the IRS gone after any C4s or like, because I know there's like a contribution limit, right? Isn't it like 50% threshold that has to be political activity? Sorry.
So yeah, so the I don't know the answer on the enforcement from the IRS, but the 50% threshold that you're talking about is basically with 501c4s in particular, they can't spend more than, they can't have a primary purpose, and that's the legal term of political activity. Colloquially, that just means that they can't spend most of their money on political activity. So the IRS is defining that as like 50% plus one. And the difficult part with this is that what the IRS defines as political activity is conservative compared to what you and I might think about as political activity. Again, because they're trying to really get after groups that are overtly breaking the rules. So things that are at the federal level referred to as electioneering communications, independent expenditure ads, basically that don't expressly advocate for or against a candidate, that aren't saying vote yes or vote no, but are instead just think of the ads where the candidate is showing up in black and white with like thunder and lightning in the background. This person is terrible and that kind of stuff. But stopping short right before the election, but stopping short of saying vote yes or no, wouldn't necessarily qualify as a political ad under IRS rules. And actually doesn't qualify as a political ad under a lot of state rules too, about half of the states.
Wow. Okay. They were promoting a no party candidate, not a specific campaign. I know it's
also it's partisan elections specifically where that becomes a real issue for the IRS.